The letter was already waiting for her when the train stopped. Caleb Thornton had not come himself. He had sent a station master to do his dirty work, pressing a sealed envelope into Elena Hartwell's hands before she had even lifted her trunk from the platform. No greeting, no apology. Just folded paper and the sound of a 5-year-old girl asking why the man from the letters wasn't there. Elena read it once. Then she stood completely still while the words rearranged themselves into something she could survive. The arrangement is canceled. Do not come to the ranch. I trust you can manage your own return. That was all. 22 to undo 6 months of carefully written letters, 2 train tickets purchased on borrowed money, and every careful hope she had permitted herself to carry west. If you have ever stood in a public place and felt the ground shift beneath you while strangers watched, if you have ever swallowed something unbearable because a child was holding your hand and you could not afford to fall apart, then you already understand what Elena Hartwell felt on that platform in Harlow Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1887. Stay with this story. If it moves you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next, and leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happened next changed everything. The station at Harlow Creek was not much of a station. It was a single-room building with a pot-bellied stove, a bench that wobbled on uneven legs, and a platform that jutted out over bare ground like an afterthought. The town itself was visible from where Elena stood, a main street of maybe 12 storefronts, a church steeple, a water tower leaning slightly east as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Beyond the town, the land stretched out in every direction, brown and enormous and indifferent. Elena had imagined Montana differently. She had imagined arriving and being met. Molly was 5 years old and had been awake since 4 in the morning, sustained through the last leg of the journey on half a biscuit and the novelty of watching the landscape change outside the window. She stood now with both hands gripping the back of her mother's coat, her small face turned upward in the particular expression children wear when they understand that something is wrong, but do not yet know what to call it. "Mama," she said, "where is the man?" "He couldn't come," Elena said. Something came up. It was not a lie, exactly. Something had certainly come up. She simply did not know yet whether it was cruelty or cowardice or something more calculated than either. The station master, a man in his 60s with a gray mustache and the apologetic posture of someone delivering bad news for a living, had retreated to the far end of the platform after handing over the letter, pretending to sort a stack of freight tags that clearly did not need sorting. 3 other people on the platform had made no similar effort to look elsewhere. A woman in a green shawl whispered something to the man beside her. A younger man near the door had stopped moving entirely and was simply watching Elena with the frank curiosity of someone who had just witnessed something interesting. Elena refolded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She picked up the larger of the 2 bags at her feet, looped the strap over her shoulder, and looked around the platform for the trunk she had checked through from Boston. It was set against the wall of the station building, tagged with her name in her own handwriting. E. Hartwell, Harlow Creek, MT. She stared at it for a moment. The trunk weighed nearly 40 pounds. She had packed it with everything she thought she might need to begin a new life. 2 good dresses, her teaching certificates, her father's copy of Blackstone's commentaries, 3 years of carefully kept account ledgers from the school district where she had worked, a tin of dried lavender that she could not explain keeping, and at the very bottom, wrapped in brown paper, the last photograph ever taken of her husband. She had not looked at that photograph in 8 months. She had not been able to. But she had not been able to leave it behind either. Molly had loosened her grip on Elena's coat and was now standing beside the trunk, patting its side like it was a familiar animal. "Can we go?" Molly said. "My feet hurt." "Yes," Elena said. "We can go." She just did not know yet where they were going. The station master cleared his throat. Elena turned. "Ma'am," he said carefully, do you have arrangements in town? A hotel or—" "Not yet," Elena said. "The Harlow house takes in boarders. Mrs. Emmett runs it. It's well." He hesitated. "She's not cheap, but she's clean." "Thank you," Elena said. She meant it without warmth, which was not his fault. She had none left to spare. She was calculating. She could not help it. It had been her survival mechanism for the last 3 years. This habit of running numbers in her head like a quiet machine operating beneath everything else she was doing. She had arrived in Montana with $11.40. A return ticket to Boston, 3rd class, cost more than she had. Mrs. Emmett's boarding house would eat through what remained within a week. There was no work she could identify from here, standing on a platform in a town she had never seen, in a territory where she knew precisely no one. The letter in her pocket was still warm from her hand. She bent down and gripped the trunk handle. It was heavier than she remembered. Her shoulder objected immediately. She shifted her grip, straightened her back, and began moving the trunk in increments toward the platform steps, lifting one end, dragging the other, then switching, an undignified and slow process that she executed with complete focused attention, because the alternative was standing still, and the alternative was not acceptable. "Ma'am," the station master started. "I have it," Elena said. She did not have it, particularly, but she had it enough. Molly followed, dragging her small bag behind her, watching her mother with the serious expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something. She had learned too early, Elena sometimes thought to read the quality of her mother's silences. This one said, "Not now." They made it to the bottom of the platform steps. Elena stood on the packed dirt of the road and looked at the town. The wind came at them sideways, carrying the smell of horses and wood smoke and something else. Something turned and gone, like autumn finishing its business. She had come 2,000 miles. She had spent the last 6 months writing letters, with careful handwriting, presenting herself as capable and honest and healthy, hiding nothing except the grief that she could not afford to let anyone see, because grief, in a woman seeking a second chance, looked too much like damage. She had arrived. The man who invited her had canceled her, in 22 words, by proxy. The woman in the green shawl had followed them to the edge of the platform. Elena could feel the watching from behind her, could imagine the whispers being assembled into a story. Mail-order bride arrived with a child. "Didn't you hear? The Thornton man turned her away right at the station. What did she expect? Coming out here with a child already. No wonder he." Elena did not turn around. She picked a direction and started walking. She had gotten perhaps 30 feet when she heard boots on the dirt behind her. "You're going the wrong way," said a man's voice. "Hotel's east." "You're headed west." She stopped, turned. He was perhaps 35, rangy in the way of men who worked outdoors and didn't think much about it, wearing a canvas coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that had survived worse. He was not looking at her with pity, which was what distinguished him immediately from everyone else she had encountered in the last 15 minutes. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they're trying to accurately assess. "I know which direction the hotel is," Elena said. "All right," he said. He glanced at the trunk. "You planning to drag that thing all the way there?" "I was managing. You were slowly." He said it without cruelty, like a plain observation. "Name's Silas Reed. I have a ranch 4 miles out. Spare room. You and the girl can stay until you figure out your next move." Molly peered around her mother's coat at this man. "Do you have animals?" "Cattle," Silas said. "Some chickens. Dog named Fletcher." "Is Fletcher nice?" "Mostly." Molly looked up at Elena, Mama. Elena looked at Silas Reed. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at things she couldn't afford to trust too quickly, looking for the angle, the cost, the thing he wasn't saying yet. He met her gaze without flinching, without performing anything. He simply waited. She had $11.40. She had a 5-year-old and a 40-pound trunk, and nowhere to sleep tonight. She had just been rejected in public by a man who had never intended to keep his word, and she was standing on a dirt road in a town that was already building a story about her. "I don't accept charity," she said. "Fine," he said. "You can work for the room. I've got accounts that haven't been properly organized in 2 years. She studied him another moment. He didn't shift under it. Didn't try to convince her further. 4 miles, she said. 4 miles, he confirmed. "If it's something other than what you've described," Elena said quietly, "I need you to understand that I will make that very unpleasant for you." Something moved in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Understood," he said. He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and started walking. Elena took Molly's hand and followed. She did not look back at the station. She did not look at the woman in the green shawl, or the man who had been watching, or the station master who had handed her a letter instead of a welcome. She looked at the road ahead and she thought, all right then. Start from here. The Reed Ranch sat in a shallow valley between 2 long ridges, and when Elena first saw it from the road, a house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, fencing that ran in uneven lines, suggesting ongoing repair, her first thought was that it was holding on by force of habit rather than actual structural health. The house was 2 stories, wood frame, with a porch that needed new boards in at least 3 places she could see from the road. The barn was solid but unpainted and showed the particular weathering of a building maintained by one person doing the work of 2. The fence lines were a patchwork, some sections new, some older and sagging, as if someone kept fixing the worst problems without ever getting ahead of them. Silas did not apologize for any of it. He set the trunk on the porch, opened the front door, and showed them inside. The interior was clean in the way of a place maintained by someone who understood the practical necessity of cleanliness without caring much about its appearance. The floors were swept. The dishes were stacked. There was a coat hook by the door with one coat on it and an empty hook beside it, which Elena noticed and chose not to think about. "Spare room is through there," Silas said. "There's a bed. I'll get another blanket for the girl." "Thank you," Elena said. Molly had gone immediately to the window at the back of the main room and was pressing her face against the glass, looking toward the barn. "Is that where the dog is?" "Fletcher sleeps in the barn," Silas confirmed. "Can I see him?" "In the morning," Elena said. Molly accepted this with the resignation of a child who knew which battles she could win. Silas showed Elena the kitchen, the pump, the outhouse behind the house. He was not a man who talked more than he needed to. He answered questions when she had them, and when she didn't ask anything, he didn't fill the silence with noise. She found this, unexpectedly, easier to navigate than most people. After Molly was settled to sleep within minutes, the travel exhaustion hitting her like a weight, Elena came back to the main room and sat at the kitchen table across from a stack of papers that Silas had pulled from a shelf without her asking. "You said you needed accounts organized," she said. "I said I had accounts that hadn't been organized. I said you could work for the room." "That's the same thing." "Close enough," he agreed. She looked at the stack. "These your father's?" He was quiet for a moment. "He died 18 months ago. I've been keeping up with the day-to-day, but the older books I haven't. There's been a lot to manage." "I understand," she said, and she meant it with more specificity than he could have known. She understood the way grief backed up against the practical demands of staying alive, understood how the things requiring careful attention were precisely the things you couldn't look at directly. "I won't pretend I'm not grateful for the help," he said. "But I'm not running a charity operation here either. I need someone who can actually tell me what the numbers mean." "I ran financial accounts for a school district in Boston for 3 years," Elena said. "Before that, I taught mathematics, and I kept my own household accounts during a time when there was very little coming in and everything going out. I know what numbers mean," he nodded. Not impressed, exactly more like reassured, like she had confirmed a calculation he had already run. "I'll need the older books too," she said. "Anything more than 2 years back. Anything relating to land payments, water rights, any outside contracts." He looked at her. "That's a specific list. I like to be thorough." He went to a cabinet in the corner and brought out 3 more ledgers, older and more worn than the stack on the table. He set them down in front of her. "I'll be up early," he said. "There are cattle to move tomorrow. You're welcome to anything in the kitchen." "Thank you, Silas." He paused at the hallway. She noticed he did it, the brief pause of a man who had learned not to say certain things and was in the habit of pausing to make sure he didn't say them. "Thornton thing," he said. "I don't need to know what happened. But if it becomes a problem, if he decides to make it a problem, you should tell me." Elena looked up at him. Why would he make it a problem? Silas's expression was difficult to read. "Caleb Thornton makes things a problem when it suits him," he said. "That's all." And he went to bed. Elena sat alone at the table with the ledgers in front of her, and the lamp burning low and the wind coming off the ridges outside, making the house settle and creak around her. She could hear Molly breathing through the thin wall of the spare room. She could hear faintly the sound of cattle somewhere in the dark. She pulled the first ledger toward her and opened it. She had been a widow for 3 years. She had been a woman managing on her own for longer than that. She had answered Caleb Thornton's advertisement, not because she was desperate in the way the word was used about women who had no options, but because she was practical, and practicality had told her that a school teacher's salary in Boston was not going to keep herself and Molly comfortable into the future, and that the West was one of the few places where a woman's capabilities were sometimes worth more than her social position. She had been practical enough to answer the advertisement. She had not been practical enough to investigate the man behind it. She was going to fix that. She opened the first ledger and started reading. The numbers were not organized the way she would have organized them, but they were legible. Silas's father, a man named Thomas Reed, whose signature appeared at the bottom of various receipts and contracts throughout the pages, had been methodical in a self-taught way, tracking income and expenditures in columns that made rough sense once you understood his system. The ranch had turned a modest profit through most of the late 1870s. Cattle sales were consistent. Water rights from the creek that crossed the eastern portion of the property were noted as secure. Then the mid-1880s arrived, and the numbers began to change. Elena worked quietly, making notes in her own small handwriting on a piece of paper she found folded in the back of the ledger. She had a habit, when working through accounts, of writing down anything that struck her as odd and coming back to it, not jumping to conclusions, but flagging the discrepancies and letting them accumulate until a pattern became apparent. By the time the lamp needed trimming, she had 3 pages of notes and a growing certainty that something was badly wrong. The first thing she noticed was the payments. They began in 1,883. Regular disbursements, always in the same amount, $42, sent to something listed simply as F. MH with no further description, no receipt attached, no contract reference, no notation of what services or goods were being purchased. Just the initials and the amount, appearing every 2 months like a heartbeat that had been built into the financial body of the ranch without explanation. Flipped forward. The payments continued. 1,884, 1,885, 1,886. They never varied. $42 every 2 months to F. MH, she checked the handwriting against other entries. Different, distinctly different around her, more careful hand than Thomas Reed's angular notations. Someone else had made these entries. Someone who had access to the ledger when Thomas was not watching it. Put the ledger down and sat very still for a moment, looking at the wall. Then she picked up the second ledger, the more recent one, and found what she was really looking for. The foreclosure notice was tucked between 2 pages, folded and creased as if it had been read many times. It was dated 4 months ago. It referenced an outstanding debt of $630 owed to the Meridian Valley Bank, secured against the deed to the Reed Ranch property. Elena had never heard of the Meridian Valley Bank. She read the notice twice. Then she found the relevant page in the ledger, the page recording the original loan that had apparently been taken out in Thomas Reed's name 3 years ago against the ranch property. The loan amount matched. The signature at the bottom was Thomas Reed's. The handwriting in the surrounding entries was not. She looked at Thomas Reed's signature on a dozen earlier documents, the contracts, the receipts, the legal notations from the 1870s and early 1880s, and then she looked at the signature on the loan document. Close, it was a good copy. But it was a copy. Elena set down the ledger and looked at her notes. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she said, very quietly, to the empty kitchen, "There it is." She did not wake Silas. She would tell him in the morning, carefully, in the right order, with the evidence laid out so he could see it the way she saw it and not be ambushed by the conclusion. But first, she needed to know one more thing. She pulled the older ledger, the one that went back the furthest, and found the property boundary surveys. They were recorded there. The eastern creek boundary, the north ridge line, the western pasture. She cross-referenced them against the ranch's grazing contracts and the water rights documents. Then she found the survey notation from 2 years ago. A new survey, commissioned apparently by the county, adjusting the eastern boundary of the Reed property, moving it approximately a quarter-mile west. The creek under the new survey now fell outside the Reed property line. Without the creek, the cattle operation was not viable. Without the cattle operation, there was no income. Without income, a $600 debt against the property could not be serviced. And a property that could not service its debt could be foreclosed upon. And the land, the water rights, the grazing access, the location could then be acquired by whoever had arranged the debt, the survey adjustment, and the manufactured financial collapse. Elena wrote Frontier Meridian Holdings at the top of a clean page because she had now noticed that the initials F, MH matched, and she had now noticed that the Meridian Valley Bank shared a word with that same entity. And she had now noticed that Caleb Thornton's name appeared nowhere in any of these documents, but that his absence was itself a kind of signature, the careful distance of a man who understood that proximity to evidence was the most dangerous thing. Put down her pen. The lamp had burned to almost nothing. She thought about the letter at the station. 22 words. She thought about 6 months of correspondence, the careful presentation of herself, the ticket she had purchased with borrowed money. She thought about a man who had written her letters in the measured language of a widower seeking a capable partner, who had described his property and his intentions and his situation in terms that were consistent and plausible, and had never, she understood now, contained a single detail she could verify. He had written her. He had invited her. He had arranged for her to arrive publicly in Harlow Creek, and then rejected her publicly at the station, creating a story that the town would tell the desperate mail-order bride, the abandoned arrival, the woman with a child and no options, a story that would explain, if anyone ever asked, why she might make unfounded accusations against a respectable landowner. He had built her cover story before she had even known she needed one. The thing was, he had been wrong about what she would do with it. Elena blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the window light. Then she folded her notes, placed them inside her teaching certificates, where they would be safe and unobtrusive, and went to the spare room where Molly was sleeping with one arm thrown over her head and her small face completely peaceful. Elena lay down beside her daughter. She did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about the surveyor who had redrawn the boundary lines and what it would take to find him. She was thinking about the bank manager at the Meridian Valley Bank and what a woman with meticulous financial records and no reason to be afraid could do in a territorial court with the right documentation. She was thinking about Silas Reed, asleep in the next room, who had picked up her trunk from the dirt and asked nothing in return except honesty. She was thinking that Caleb Thornton had miscalculated. He had sent her a letter designed to humiliate and dismiss and neutralize her before she could become a problem. Instead, he had driven her to the one place where his entire operation was most vulnerable, a ranch whose accounts still contained, if you knew how to read them, the fingerprints of everything he had done. He had aimed her, without knowing it, directly at his own worst secret. Elena closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved across the Montana dark, across the ridges and the broken fence lines and the creek that someone had tried to steal. Fletcher the dog barked once from the barn, and then went quiet. Molly, sleeping, made a small sound and pressed closer. Elena put her arm around her daughter. All right, she thought again. Start from here, she told Silas at breakfast. Not everything, not the full architecture of what she had found, not yet, because she had learned long ago that presenting too much at once caused people to reject the conclusion before they had absorbed the evidence. She told him about the payments to FMH. She told him about the loan document with the copied signature. She watched his face. He sat very still across the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, and he listened the way certain people listen, without interrupting, without performing reactions, just taking it in and turning it over. Molly was outside with Fletcher. Elena had sent her out deliberately, telling her she could visit the dog for 20 minutes, which they both understood meant longer. You found all that last night, Silas said when she finished. I found enough to know there's more, Elena said. I'd like to keep looking if you'll let me. He was quiet for a moment. My father didn't take out a loan against this property, he said. I would have known, I believe that. He was careful with debt. Almost it bothered him, carrying it. He paid off the original land note 2 years before he had to. Silas looked down at the table. He wouldn't have borrowed $600 against the deed. Not without telling me. Someone signed his name, Elena said. Kept her voice level. It's a good copy. Whoever did it had access to his actual signature contracts, receipts, something he'd signed in an official capacity. They studied it. The muscle along Silas's jaw tightened. How long ago? The loan document is dated 3 years back. The boundary survey adjustment is 2 years old. The foreclosure notice came 4 months ago. She paused. Payments to FMH go back to 1,883. Whoever this is, they've been working on this for a long time. Silas stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the yard where Molly had crouched down to have some serious conversation with the dog. He stood there long enough that Elena wondered if he was going to say something she'd have to argue, with something about how she couldn't know for certain, or how it wasn't her problem to involve herself in. Frontier Meridian Holdings, he said. That's what the initials resolve to. I haven't confirmed it yet. I'd need access to county business records to verify the registration. Caleb Thornton, Silas said. Not a question. Elena looked at the back of his head. You already suspected. He turned around. His expression was not the expression of a man hearing new information. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy and had just been told he was right about what it was. I suspected something. The survey adjustment didn't make sense to me when it happened. County said it was a correction, an old error in the original plat. My father was gone by then, and I had a lot to manage. He stopped. I hired a lawyer in town. He told me the adjustment was legitimate and the foreclosure was valid, and my best option was to negotiate terms. Who was the lawyer? Warren Gale. Elena wrote the name down. What are you writing? Silas said. His name, she said. A lawyer who tells a client that an obviously falsified loan document is legitimate is either incompetent or complicit. Either way, he's part of the picture. Silas looked at her notepad. Then he looked at her. You've done this before, he said. Not the frontier fraud specifically, but finding things in numbers that people tried to hide. School superintendent in Boston was skimming operating funds for 4 years, Elena said. I was the one who found it. I was not particularly thanked for it. She said it without self-pity, just as information. I lost my position 6 months after I reported it. The official reason was a reduction in staff. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It taught me to be thorough before I say anything, she said. And to make copies, he almost smiled. It was a small thing, and it disappeared quickly. What do you need? I need to go to the county records office, she said. I need the original property surveys, the ones from before the adjustment. I need to see the registration documents for Frontier Meridian Holdings, if they exist under that name or anything close to it. And I need to talk to whoever conducted the 1,885 boundary survey. That would be the county surveyor, Silas said. Man named Aldous Pruitt. He's been county surveyor for 15 years. Is he honest? Silas thought about it. I used to think so. Then he was pressured, Elena said. Paid. Either way, he knows what he changed and why. From outside came the sound of Molly laughing at something Fletcher had done. A pure sound, uncomplicated, the kind of sound that existed on a completely different plane from everything happening at the kitchen table. There's something else, Elena said. She had been deciding whether to say this and had decided she had to. Caleb Thornton didn't write me those letters to find a wife. Silas waited. He needed a public event, she said. A mail-order bride arriving with a child, it's the kind of thing a whole town watches, kind of story people repeat. And then if that woman later starts asking uncomfortable questions about local property records, there's already a story in place. She's bitter. She was rejected. She's looking for revenge. Elena folded her hands on the table. He created my motive before I had one. The silence in the kitchen stretched. He didn't count on you actually finding something, Silas said. He didn't count on me looking, she said. He thought I'd leave. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Are you going to? No, Elena said. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without performance, like a statement of basic fact. I am not, he nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. I'll take you to the county records office Thursday. Market day, more people in town, less likely anyone notices a specific errand. He paused. I'll also drive you past Pruitt's office. You can decide whether you want to go in. I'll want to go in, Elena said. I figured. She gathered her notes and the ledgers and carried them to the spare room where she had claimed a corner of the floor to use as a workspace. Stacked everything carefully, cross-referenced, with her own notation system, written on the inside cover of a composition book she had bought in Boston for Molly to draw in. Molly had used 3 pages and lost interest. Elena had repurposed it without guilt. She heard Silas go out the back door. She heard the sounds of the ranch, resuming the particular rhythm of a working day. Boots on the porch steps, the creak of the barn door, cattle noise from somewhere east. She heard Molly come inside and start telling someone. Presumably the dog had followed her, in about a rabbit she had seen near the water trough. Elena sat on the floor with the ledgers around her and kept working. She was looking for more FMH entries, tracing the payment pattern across all 3 ledgers to build a complete timeline. She found 11 in the oldest ledger, 7 in the middle one, and then nothing in the current accounts, which meant the payments had stopped approximately 18 months ago, around the time Thomas Reed had died. They stopped because they were no longer necessary. By then the debt was manufactured, the boundary was redrawn, and the foreclosure mechanism was already in motion. Payments had been operational costs, bribes most likely, to whoever was maintaining the fiction from inside the ranch's financial records. That meant someone with regular access to the ledgers. Someone Thomas Reed had trusted enough to handle paperwork in his absence. Elena went back to the entries and looked again at the handwriting. The FMH entries were all in that same careful, rounded hand. She flipped through the older ledger, comparing, and found it again in a different context, on a page recording a lumber purchase from 4 years back. At the bottom of the page, a note, Verified delivery, MGM. She wrote it down and sat with it. The lumber delivery note was mundane, clearly written by whoever had been present when the lumber arrived. Initials used instead of a signature, the way someone would do if they considered themselves an employee rather than an owner. G. A ranch hand, maybe, or a hired bookkeeper, or someone employed in a capacity that gave them access to the building and the records without raising questions. She needed a name. She needed to know who had worked this ranch during the years those payments were being made. She found Silas at the fence line behind the barn, pulling wire tight against a new post. He worked with the economy of someone who had done this so many times it had become muscle rather than thought. The movements automatic and efficient even when the result was imperfect. The wire was slightly uneven. She could see it from 15 feet. "Who kept books for your father?" she said. "Between 1883 and maybe 2 years ago." Someone with initials GM Silas drove a staple into the post. "Gideon Mercer," he said without looking up. "Worked the ranch for about 6 years. Did some bookkeeping, some general labor. My father trusted him. What happened to him? Quit about 2 years ago. Moved to, I want to say, Billings. Took a position at a stockyard." He straightened and looked at her. "You think he was keeping those books the way someone told him to?" "I think he wrote the FMH entries," she said. "Whether he knew what he was doing or was told it was legitimate, I can't say yet. But his handwriting is in those ledgers at specific points that align with the payment pattern." Silas was quiet. She could see him working through it, the revision of a person he had known, reclassifying them from background to foreground, from trusted face to question mark. It was not a comfortable process. "Gideon he wasn't clever," Silas said finally. "He was a good worker. Honest, I thought. But he would have done what someone told him to do if the explanation sounded reasonable." He drove another staple. Someone could have told him the payments were legitimate business expenses. He'd have written them down and not asked. "That's what I think too," Elena said, "which means he's more useful as a witness than a culprit, if we can find him." She paused. "Do you have an address in Billings?" "Not personally. The stockyards aren't hard to find." She nodded. She turned to go back to the house and then stopped. "One more thing. The lawyer you hired, Warren Gale. When you told him about the foreclosure, what exactly did he say?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He set down the fencing tool and leaned against the post. "He said the loan was in my father's name, properly executed, and that the bank had the right to foreclose. He said I could try to contest it, but the cost of litigation would exceed the value of the outcome." A pause. "He said my best option was to sell before the foreclosure completed, so I'd get some money back rather than nothing. Who would he have suggested you sell to?" Silas looked at her. "I'm asking," Elena said carefully, "because a lawyer who steers a client toward an unnecessary sale, when that sale would benefit a specific third party, has committed a very specific kind of wrong that courts take seriously." "He didn't mention a buyer," Silas said. "But 3 days after I met with him, I got a written offer from a land company called Consolidated Rangeland Partners. They offered 60 cents on the dollar for the property." Elena wrote Consolidated Rangeland Partners in her notebook. "Same offer structure as Frontier Meridian Holdings," she said, more to herself than to him. "Different name." "Different name," Silas confirmed. She looked up at him. "He has at least 3 named entities," she said. "Frontier Meridian Holdings, Meridian Valley Bank, Consolidated Rangeland Partners. Probably more. The point of multiple names is to make the connections equal to traits. Each entity looks separate. Each transaction looks isolated." She closed the notebook. "Except they're not." Silas looked at her steadily. "How do you prove they're not?" "Paper," she said. "It always comes down to paper. The registrations, the signatories, the bank account holders somewhere, all 3 names connect to the same person or the same set of people. You find that connection, and the whole structure collapses." She went back to the house. That evening after dinner, a meal that Silas cooked with the efficiency of someone used to feeding himself and not particularly invested in the result, a large pot of beef and potato that was hot and filling, and exactly as interesting as it needed to be. Molly fell asleep in the spare room, and Elena moved her notebooks to the kitchen table. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her without asking if she minded. She didn't. She had found in the last 24 hours that his particular variety of silence was one she could work inside without friction. "Tell me about Caleb Thornton," she said. "Not as a swindler, as a person. What do people think of him?" Silas turned his cup in his hands. "They think he's successful," he said. "He came to the territory about 12 years ago, Bought the old Harrington spread. Nobody really knew where the money came from, but he paid cash, and that tends to silence questions. Built it up, started a cattle operation, added land over the years. He's on the County Board of Agriculture. He donated the new reading room at the library. A pause. People like him because he's generous in public, and because he seems like the kind of man who built something from scratch, and people around here respect that. And privately, he's not someone you contradict, Silas said. I've seen men back down from him in conversations where they were clearly right. Something about the way he holds himself, like the concept of losing, hasn't occurred to him as a real possibility. Elena thought about a man who had written her warm, careful letters for 6 months, who had described his ranch as comfortable and his intentions as sincere, who had composed those letters with enough specificity to seem real and enough vagueness to deny later. How many other properties has he acquired in the last 5 years? I know of 3, Silas said. The Drummond homestead west of town, the water rights on Farlow Creek that used to belong to the Nolan family, and the pasture land the old widow Beaumont sold 2 years ago. He looked at his coffee. All of them sold under circumstances that seemed distressed. The Drummonds had a debt problem. The Nolans had a legal dispute over the water access that they couldn't afford to fight. Mrs. Beaumont, she just said she was tired and wanted to go to her sister in Oregon. Did anyone help them? Elena said. The Drummonds, the Nolans. Warren Gale represented the Drummonds, Silas said. I don't know about the Nolans. Elena wrote the names down. She drew a line across the bottom of the page, and below it wrote a single question: how many properties total? She looked at the map in her head, the one she had been building from the ledgers and the county records she had not yet seen, and the names Silas had given her. A man with enough land, enough water access, enough political goodwill to sit on the county board, and a network of front companies that made each acquisition look unrelated. A lawyer to give the transactions the appearance of legal process. County surveyor to redraw boundaries when required. And apparently a habit of sending for mail-order brides to use as narrative cover. She wondered how many women he had written letters to, whether she was the first, or whether there had been others women who had arrived and been dismissed and had left, confused and humiliated, without ever understanding what they had walked into. The thought made her grip her pen slightly harder than necessary. What is it? Silas said. She looked up. He had been watching her face, she realized, not intrusively, but with the attentiveness of a man who noticed things and cataloged them without making a show of it. I was thinking about the letters, she said. Whether he does this regularly, uses an arrival as a distraction. I don't know, Silas said honestly. I haven't heard of it before. But I also wasn't looking for it. No, she said, nobody would be. It's too strange a thing to look for. She went back to her notes. He stayed at the table, not talking, occasionally refilling his coffee, and she worked in the particular productive quiet of someone who has found the shape of a problem and is now carefully filling in its edges. At some point, she wasn't certain, when the quality of the silence changed slightly, became more settled, and she looked up to find that Silas had fallen asleep in the chair across from her with his arms crossed and his head tilted back at an angle that was going to bother his neck in the morning. He slept the way he did everything else, without excess. She looked at him for a moment, which felt like something she had not quite planned. Then she looked away and went back to her work. Thursday came cold and clear, the sky the particular pale blue of early Montana autumn that looked beautiful until the wind reminded you of what was coming. Silas drove them into town in the ranch wagon. Molly sat between them on the bench, wrapped in a blanket Elena had found in the spare room chest, alert and cheerful in the way she became when something was happening. She had appointed herself the chief observer of all passing scenery, and provided running commentary on horses, fences, and a hawk she spotted circling over a field to the east. He's looking for breakfast, she announced. Probably, Silas said. Does he have a family? Hawks usually do. Molly considered this with the gravity of someone gathering important information. The county records office was in a brick building on the eastern end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, wedged between a surveying equipment supply and a law office that Elena deliberately did not look at as they passed. Clerk inside was a young man with ink-stained fingers who looked like he had been installed behind the counter sometime in the previous decade and had not left. Elena explained what she needed in terms that were accurate but unremarkable. She was helping a local rancher review historical property documentation. She needed the original surveys for the Reed property going back to 1878, and any registered business filings under names containing the words Frontier, Meridian, or Consolidated. Clerk disappeared into the back. Silas stood near the door. Molly, who had been left with specific instructions to touch nothing, was touching nothing but examining everything at close range, with her hands folded behind her back, a posture Elena had taught her for museum visits. The clerk returned with a folder. Original surveys I've got. Business filings. We only keep registrations going back 5 years. And what I've got under those names is, he flipped through some papers, Frontier Meridian Holdings, registered 1,000, 881, registered agent listed as a Wallace Crane of Billings, and Consolidated Rangeland Partners, registered 1,000, 884, same agent. Elena wrote both names down. Is there a Meridian Valley Bank registration? He checked. Not here. That'd be a Territorial Bank charter, different office. Territorial Commerce in Helena. Thank you, she said. She took the original surveys and spread them on the counter. The 1,878 survey was clear. The eastern boundary of the Reed property ran along the creek's centerline standard water rights demarcation for the era, giving the Reed Ranch full access to the water source on that side. The 1,885 survey, the one listed as a correction, moved the boundary a quarter-mile west of the creek. The adjustment was marked as a technical correction to a measurement error in the original. The surveyor's signature, Aldous Pruitt. Elena photographed both in her memory. She had learned early that she could not always take documents with her, so she read them the way she would read something she intended to reconstruct word for word later. She noted every number, every measurement, every notation. "Can I see the Pruitt survey in full?" she said to the clerk. He found it. She read it carefully. Then she found what she was looking for in the measurement tables. The baseline reference point used to establish the boundary adjustment was a granite marker listed as installed in 1,884 1 year before the survey, and conveniently located in a position that, if used as a reference, would necessarily push the boundary line west. A marker installed for the specific purpose of providing false grounding for a false correction. "Where is the surveyor's office?" she said. Silas drove her there while Molly waited in the wagon with strict instructions and a piece of hard candy from Elena's coat pocket. Aldous Pruitt was a man in his late 60s who had the complexion of someone who had spent decades outdoors and the eyes of someone who had spent the last 2 years not sleeping well. He looked at Elena when she came through his office door with the expression of a man who has been expecting a particular kind of visitor and has been hoping she would not arrive. "Mr. Pruitt," Elena said. She sat down across from his desk without being invited to, which she had found tended to establish the correct register for a conversation. "I'm reviewing the property records for the Reed Ranch on behalf of the owner. I have some questions about the 1,885 boundary adjustment." Pruitt's hands, folded on his desk, pressed together slightly. "That survey was properly conducted." "I'm sure it was conducted," Elena said. "I have a question about the baseline reference point. The granite marker used to establish the correction, when was it installed, and by whom?" That information would be in the county records." "I just came from the county records," Elena said pleasantly. "The marker was installed in 1,884, 1 year before your survey. I'd like to know who commissioned its installation." Pruitt looked at his desk. "The county commissioners authorized the marker as part of a general resurveying initiative. Which other properties were resurveyed in that initiative?" He didn't answer immediately. In the silence, Elena could hear the sound of the street outside, a wagon passing, someone calling out to someone else. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, her voice unchanged, "I'm not here to make your life difficult. I'm here because a man I believe to be innocent is about to lose his property to a fraudulent debt, and the boundary adjustment on his land is part of how the fraud was constructed. I believe you know that." She paused. "I also believe that a man who spent 40 years building a professional reputation might be willing to correct a record that was made under pressure before a court asks him to do it under oath." The surveyor's hands pressed together tighter. His jaw moved. He looked at the window. He looked at his desk. He looked at a point somewhere between Elena and the wall behind her. "I was told," he said finally, his voice low and strained, "that the correction was legitimate, that there was a genuine measurement error in the original survey. I was given the baseline reference and told it had been independently verified." He stopped. "I had questions. I had questions that were addressed in terms I found." He stopped again. "I needed the county contract renewal." "I understand," Elena said. She meant it. She also did not intend to let it matter. Will you sign a statement to that effect? That you were provided the baseline reference by a third party, that you were told it had been independently verified, and that your role was to apply it rather than establish it. Pruitt stared at her. Who are you? My name is Elena Hartwell. I'm a financial analyst assisting Silas Reed with the defense of his property against a fraudulent foreclosure. She had never described herself as a financial analyst in her life. It was not inaccurate. Will you sign a statement? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she began planning what she would do if he refused, what other pressure points existed, what other paths around him led to the same destination. I'll sign, he said. It came out like something being put down after a long carry. I'd want a lawyer present. That's reasonable, Elena said. I'd recommend one from outside Harlow Creek. He looked at her sharply. She met his gaze without elaboration. I'll arrange it, she said. She stood up and offered her hand. He shook it, briefly, like a man who wasn't sure the gesture was appropriate to the circumstances, but couldn't identify a better one. She walked out of the office and back to the wagon, where Silas was standing with his arms crossed, and Molly was telling him something involved and animated involving the hawk from earlier, and a theory she had developed about its territorial range. Well, Silas said. He'll sign a statement, Elena said. Silas stared at her. You were in there 11 minutes. He was already tired of carrying it, she said. She climbed up to the wagon seat. People usually are by the time someone finally asks directly. She took the reins and then remembered she didn't know the horse and handed them back to Silas. We should write to Gideon Mercer in Billings. Tonight, Silas agreed. Climbed up. Elena. She looked at him. He seemed to be deciding how to say something. He had that look again, the pause before a sentence he wasn't sure of. I want you to understand that this property, he stopped. My father built this from ground that was nothing. 20 years of work. He deserved better than what happened to it. I know, she said. That's why we're not stopping. Silas looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned the horse toward home. The letter to Gideon Mercer went out that evening, written in Elena's careful hand, asking factual questions, only whether he had maintained the Reed Ranch accounts during the specified years, whether he had made entries on behalf of a third party, whether he had been instructed to record certain payments in specific ways. The letter did not accuse. It offered gently but plainly that a man who had followed instructions without fully understanding their purpose was in a very different legal and moral position than a man who had designed those instructions. It was the truth. Elena had believed that about the superintendent in Boston too, and she had been wrong in that case. The superintendent had known exactly what he was doing and had constructed the system himself. But Silas's assessment of Gideon Mercer, not clever, not a designer of schemes, rang true in the way such assessments sometimes do when they come from someone who worked alongside the person for years. She sealed the letter. Molly appeared in the doorway of the spare room in her nightgown, holding the stuffed rabbit she traveled with, a small animal of indeterminate species that had been repaired so many times it was now more thread than original fabric. Mama, Molly said, "Are we staying here?" Elena looked at her daughter. For a while she said carefully, "I like it here," Molly said. She said it with the directness of a 5-year-old, not a request, not pressure, just information she thought her mother should have. Fletcher let me pet his ears today. That's high praise from Fletcher, Elena said. Molly smiled and went back to bed. Elena sat at the desk and looked at the letter in her hand, and beyond it, at nothing in particular, at the wall of the spare room that someone, probably Thomas Reed, she thought, from the quality of the brushwork, had painted a deep cream color sometime in the previous decade and not repainted since. She thought about what was coming, the territorial court, the witnesses, the documents, the countermoves Caleb Thornton would certainly make when he realized what was being built against him. Because a man who had spent years constructing a machine this intricate would not simply accept its dismantling. He would attack her credibility. He had already given himself the tools to do it. The rejected bride, the bitter woman, the desperate outsider, with no stake in the community. She thought about whether she was frightened. The honest answer was that she was, in the way she was always frightened when she understood the full size of a problem, not a paralyzed fright, but the operational kind, the kind that made her movements more precise and her thinking more careful. Kind her mother had called good sense, dressed in uncomfortable clothes. She had carried this kind of fear before. When her husband died and left her with Molly and bills she could not immediately pay, she had been afraid in exactly this way, clearly. Usefully afraid, afraid in a direction. She had gotten through that. She had built something workable from what remained. She could do this too. She sealed the letter to Gideon Mercer and set it with the other papers. Then she pulled the composition book toward her and began drafting a timeline, a clean, court-ready document showing the sequence of events from the first F.M.H. payment, in wind 883 to the foreclosure notice 4 months ago, every date supported by a specific document, in a specific ledger, on a specific page. Outside, the wind came off the ridges again. The house made its sounds. Fletcher barked once, distantly, and was quiet, Elena wrote. She wrote because the paper was the armor and the weapon, and the only thing, in the end, that held against men who had built their power on the assumption that other people's records were too disorganized to use against them. She wrote because Silas's father had deserved better, and Silas deserved better, and the families who had lost land and water rights and their grip on what they had built deserved someone to put it all into a form a court could read. She wrote because she had come west to find a life, and she was, apparently, going to build one with her own hands whether she had planned to or not. The lamp burned, the pages filled, and in the spare room, Molly slept with her worn rabbit pressed against her chest in a house 4 miles outside Harlow Creek, Montana, that was not yet home but was beginning, against all probability, to feel like it might become one. Gideon Mercer wrote back in 10 days. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice about water assessment fees that Silas had apparently been ignoring for several months. Elena recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it, the same rounded, careful script from the ledger entries, and she sat down at the kitchen table before she read it, taking a moment to make sure she was ready to receive whatever it contained without reacting in a way that would make it harder to think. 3 pages. Mercer wrote the way he had kept books, not elegantly, but methodically, one thing at a time, in the order things had happened. He had started working the Reed Ranch in the spring of 1881. Thomas Reed had hired him as a general hand with secondary duties in the account books, because Thomas was better with cattle than numbers and knew it. He had been a good employer, Mercer wrote, fair and consistent. The work was honest. In the summer of 1883, a man had come to the ranch. He had arrived on a Tuesday when Thomas was out moving cattle to the north pasture, and he had introduced himself as an associate of a regional land development company with an interest in various ranch properties in the valley. He had explained that the company sometimes made operational support payments to ranches that were potential investment partners, goodwill payments, he called them, a way of establishing relationships before any formal arrangement was pursued. He had given Mercer an envelope containing $42 and asked him to record it in the accounts under the company's abbreviated name, F.M.H. He had said this was a standard business practice. He had said Thomas Reed was aware of the arrangement. Mercer had written the entry. He had written 9 more over the following years. Each time the same man arrived with an envelope and the same explanation. He had never asked Thomas Reed about it directly. The man had told him Thomas was aware, and Mercer had believed it, partly because the explanation sounded plausible, and partly he wrote this plainly, without excusing himself because $42 was a significant sum, and he had not wanted to make trouble that might cost him his position. When Thomas died, the man stopped coming. By then, Mercer had already been feeling uneasy about the arrangement for some time, and when Silas took over and the general mood of the ranch changed, he had found a position in Billings and taken it without discussing any of what he knew. He wrote, "I understand now that I was used to record something that was not legitimate. I don't know what it was used for, and I should have asked more questions than I did. If you need me to say what I've written here in front of a court or a lawyer, I will come. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm not willing to compound it by staying quiet when someone is being cheated." At the bottom of the 3rd page, he had added, "The man who came to the ranch was not tall. He wore good boots. He always carried a leather folder, and he always knew when Thomas would be gone before he arrived. I don't know his name, but I could describe him." Elena read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and pressed her hands flat on the surface for a moment, the way she did when she needed to stop her thinking from moving faster than was useful. She heard Silas' boots on the porch steps. He came through the door, saw her face, and stopped. "What happened?" "Mercer will testify," she said. "He'll come in person." He described the payment system and the man who ran it. She slid the letter across the table. Silas read it standing up, one hand on the doorframe. His expression moved through several things she couldn't fully read. When he put the letter down, his jaw was set, and his eyes had the particular look of a man who was managing a very specific kind of anger by keeping it completely still. He should have said something, Silas said. Yes, Elena agreed. He should have. He didn't, and he knows it, and he's willing to come forward anyway. That's what matters right now. Silas looked at her. He was deciding whether to say more about it. She could see him deciding, and then he set it aside the way practical men sometimes set aside emotions they can't afford at the moment. What does this give us? He said. Elena pulled her composition book toward her and showed him the page she had been working on before the letter arrived. We have the falsified boundary survey with Pruitt's signed statement that the baseline reference came from an outside party. We have the ledger entries with Mercer's testimony explaining how they were made and by whom. We have the loan document with the copied signature against your father's authentic signature on a dozen earlier contracts. She turned the page. What we don't have yet is the connection between MH and Caleb Thornton by name. We can demonstrate the fraud. We need to demonstrate who directed it. Silas sat down across from her. Wallace Crane, he said. The registered agent for Frontier Meridian Holdings. The one from the county records. I've been thinking about him, Elena said. A registered agent is often just a lawyer or a business manager hired to put their name on papers. They're not necessarily involved in the operation itself. But whoever hired Crane would have left a payment trail. She tapped her pen on the page. And there's the description Mercer gave. A man who always knew when Thomas was away before he arrived. Carried a leather folder and wore good boots. That's someone who had access to Thomas Reed's schedule. Only a few people would know my father's movements that specifically, Silas said slowly. Thus, the men who worked the ranch. And anyone who knew the ranch well enough to know his patterns. He stopped. Thornton Spread is 7 miles north. Harlow Creek is the only town for 40 miles. Everyone comes to market day, attends the same auctions. My father was predictable. Certain days he'd be in town. Certain days he'd be moving cattle. Anyone watching for a few months could have mapped it. But watching implies intent from the beginning, Elena said. He was targeted, Silas. Your father was identified as a target before the payments began. Kitchen was quiet. Outside, Molly was somewhere near the east fence, talking to Fletcher in the serious, unhurried way she had developed over the past 2 weeks, treating the dog as a conversational equal who required full explanations. Silas looked at the composition book. What's the next step? I need to find an honest lawyer, Elena said, not from this county. Someone who practices in territorial court and who isn't connected to anything here. She paused. Pruitt mentioned Helena. I think that's where we start. I know someone, Silas said. He said it carefully, the way he said things he wasn't sure of. Or I know of someone. A man named Nathan Cross. He represented a family in Chouteau County 2 years back. A water rights case. One against a company that had the county judge in their pocket. He's known for taking cases other lawyers won't touch. How do you know about him? My father mentioned him once. He'd read about the case in the territorial paper and said Silas looked at the table. He said that was the kind of lawyer you wanted if you were ever in real trouble. He said that it was a useful thing to know, but not a thing he ever expected to need. Elena wrote Nathan Cross, Helena, at the top of a clean page. Write to him today, she said. Send it with the summary I've already drafted and a copy of the timeline. Don't ask for his opinion. Ask for his representation. Silas raised an eyebrow slightly. Difference? Asking for an opinion invites a long response that may or may not commit to anything. Asking for representation requires a yes or a no. She met his eyes. We need a yes. 3 days later, Caleb Thornton rode past the Reed Ranch. It was not unusual the road that ran past the property was a county road, and people used it regularly. But he rode slowly, and he did not look away from the house as he passed. And Elena, who happened to be on the porch checking the water barrel, felt his gaze the way you feel weather changing a pressure shift, not visible but real. She did not move. She stood with her hand on the barrel rim and looked back at him. He was exactly as she had imagined from his letters, and entirely different from what she had imagined from his letters. He was a large man, well dressed for horseback, with the deliberate bearing of someone who had practiced confidence for so long it had become indistinguishable from the natural kind. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. His face was angular and controlled. He looked at her for exactly as long as he chose to, and then he turned his horse and rode on without acknowledgement. Elena went inside and found Silas in the kitchen. He just rode past, she said. Silas looked up from the harness he was repairing. Something shifted in his expression. Where's Molly? Still at the barn with Fletcher. She said it calmly, But she noticed that her first instinct had also been to locate Molly, which told her something about how she was reading the situation. He didn't stop. He just looked. "He knows you're here," Silas said. He set the harness down. "He's known since the day you arrived, something like that. In a town like this, everyone knows inside an afternoon. But riding past, looking at the house, that's a message." "I know what it is," Elena said. She sat down. "He's assessing how frightened I am. And I'm going to stay on the porch when he rides past," she said, "so he gets his answer." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Elena, he's not just a man who does crooked business. He has people here, people whose livelihoods depend on his favor. If he decides you're a problem that needs to be solved in a way that isn't legal—" "I know," she said. "I don't think you should be alone on the property when I'm out moving cattle." "I have a rifle," she said. At his expression, it was my husband's. "I know how to use it before you ask." He closed his mouth, opened it again. "I wasn't going to ask, you were," she said, not unkindly. "Most people do." There was a beat of silence that had a different quality than their usual silences, something slightly more uncertain in it, slightly more aware of itself. "I'll rearrange the cattle schedule," he said finally. "I can move the north herd with one of the Delacroix boys from the neighboring property. I won't need to be gone more than a few hours at a stretch." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm choosing to." He picked up the harness again, which she understood meant the conversation on that particular point was finished. She went back to the spare room and her papers. She sat down on the floor with her back against the bed frame and the composition book in her lap, and she made herself be honest, the way she had trained herself to be honest when the numbers didn't say what she wanted them to say. She was afraid. Not of the rifle shot kind of danger, or not only that. She was afraid of what happened if she was wrong, not about the fraud. She was certain about the fraud, but about her ability to prove it in a way that held. Courts required more than truth. They required truth presented in a form that survived attack, and Caleb Thornton was going to attack everything she had. He was going to attack her. She put the composition book down and picked up the letter she had drafted to Nathan Cross. She read it over once more, looking for weakness. It was good. It was organized and specific, and it presented the evidence without overstating the certainty of any conclusion she could not yet fully support. She added one more line at the bottom. "I would like to discuss this at your earliest opportunity. The foreclosure hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from date." She sealed it. Nathan Cross arrived in Harlow Creek on a Friday morning, which was 11 days after Silas's letter and 7 days before Elena had expected him. He was younger than she had pictured, perhaps 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that was good quality but had traveled hard to get here. He had a leather document case, which Elena registered with a particular attention, given Mercer's description in his letter. Cross's folder was battered and ink-marked and clearly functional rather than decorative, and his boots, though decent, showed real use. He had ridden the train to the Territorial Junction and hired a horse from there, arriving at the ranch in the late morning when Silas was mending fence on the south line, and Elena was at the kitchen table with Molly, running through a reading lesson that was going moderately well for someone who kept wanting to look out the window at something more interesting. Cross tied his horse at the rail and knocked. Elena answered the door. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "Nathan Cross. I came as soon as I could." He looked at the composition book under her arm. "Is that the documentation summary you sent?" "A copy," she said. "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table, and she laid the evidence before him, in the order she had arranged it ledgers first, then her timeline, then Pruitt's written statement, then Mercer's letter, then the 2 surveys with the measurement discrepancies annotated in her hand. She talked him through each piece in the same order, without embellishment, the way she had presented difficult information to school board members who didn't want to hear it directly, specifically, and with enough patience to wait for the questions. Cross asked good questions. He asked them precisely, following the logic of the evidence rather than the logic of a predetermined conclusion. And when something was unclear, he said so plainly rather than pretending to understand and moving on. Molly, who had relocated to a corner of the kitchen with her rabbit and her drawing paper, watched the proceedings with interest and the occasional whispered comment to the rabbit. "The weak point," Cross said finally, "is the connection between the front companies and Thornton, personally. Everything else is documented. The motive, the mechanism, the specific fraudulent acts, it's there. But a defense attorney will argue that Frontier Meridian Holdings is a legitimate business entity, that the payments to the Reed Ranch accounts were ordinary business dealings, and that the boundary survey was a legitimate administrative correction. He looked at his notes. We need to put Thornton's name on the company. I've been looking at Wallace Crane, Elena said, the registered agent. He's a lawyer in Billings. If we can depose him, if we can get him in front of a judge and ask how he came to be associated with Frontier Meridian Holdings and who retained his services, and when he'll invoke attorney-client privilege, Cross said. He can't invoke it to cover a fraud, Elena said. Crime-fraud exception. Cross looked at her over his glasses. You know territorial law? I know the Blackstone principles that territorial law derives from, she said. And I read. He studied her for a moment. All right. Crane is a possibility, but it'll require a motion, and that motion tips our hand before we're ready. He tapped his pen on the table. What else do we have on the personal connection? Elena had been saving this, not because she wanted to be theatrical about it, but because she had needed to be certain before she said it, and she had been certain for 4 days. The man who delivered the payments to Gideon Mercer, she said. Mercer's description, good boots, leather folder, always knew Thomas Reed's schedule. Arrived only when Thomas was away. She opened the composition book to a specific page. 3 years ago, Caleb Thornton's ranch filed an application for expanded grazing access on county land adjacent to the Reed property's north boundary. The application required a survey of neighboring ranches, operational schedules, who was where, when to assess the impact on existing water usage patterns. Cross was very still. That application is in the county records, Elena said. I requested it last week. The survey was conducted by a county assessor working under Thornton's application. The assessor's report includes a detailed schedule of Thomas Reed's operational patterns, which days he moved cattle, which days he was in town, when the ranch was typically managed by hands rather than the owner directly. She set the page in front of Cross. The report is dated April 1883, the first FMH. Payment appears in the ledger. In June 1883. The kitchen was very quiet. That's how he knew, Silas said from the doorway. Elena had not heard him come in. He was standing with his hat in his hand, mud on his boots, and the expression of a man who has just understood the full shape of something terrible. He had a county record telling him exactly when my father wasn't there. It doesn't put him in the room, Cross said carefully, but it establishes that he had access to precisely the information the person delivering those payments needed at precisely the right time. He looked at Elena. This is the connection we need for the motion. We don't need Crane. We need that county application, the assessor's report, and a judge who will look at the timeline. I have certified copies, Elena said. She pulled them from under the ledgers where she had placed them, because she had known, when she requested them, that she would be handing them to a lawyer before the week was out. Cross took the copies. He looked at them carefully. Then he looked at Elena with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like the recognition of a kind of competence he had not necessarily anticipated. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, how long have you been building this case? Since the second night I was here, she said. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. We file for an injunction to halt the foreclosure on Monday. I'll write the motion tonight. I need Pruitt available to give a deposition within the week, and I need Mercer to come from Billings within 10 days. I'll contact them both today, Elena said. I'll need a base of operations. Is there a hotel in town that isn't owned by someone with a connection to Thornton? The Harlow House, Silas said. Mrs. Emmett. She's not connected to anyone. That'll do. Cross began organizing the documents into his case with the methodical care of a man who had handled a lot of important paper and had learned to treat all of it like it was the most important piece. One more thing, he said. Thornton's lawyers, and he will have lawyers, plural, and they'll be good, are going to make you the story, Mrs. Hartwell. You arrived here as a jilted mail-order bride with a grudge. They're going to use that construct to explain away everything you've found. Every document, every witness, every timeline, they'll say. It's the product of a woman's revenge. I know, Elena said. I need you to be prepared for that to happen in public, possibly in a courtroom, possibly at the foreclosure hearing where anyone in the territory can attend. I'm prepared, she said. He looked at her. Because the way they'll do it. Cross, she said quietly. I came to Montana with a 5-year-old and $11 because I answered a letter from a man I had never met, and when I arrived he had a station master hand me a rejection in front of a crowd of strangers. I have been the subject of public humiliation in this town from the moment I stepped off the train. The difference between then and now is that then I had nothing, And now I have ledgers and surveys and 2 witnesses and a timeline that a court can read. Cross was quiet. They can say what they like about why I started looking, she said. What they cannot say is that I made any of it up. Closed his document case. No, he agreed. They cannot say that. The injunction hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday, which gave them 8 days. Those 8 days were the most compressed and exhausting of Elena's life, which was a meaningful statement given the competition. Cross worked from Mrs. Emmett's front parlor, which Mrs. Emmett had offered without being asked when she understood in general terms what the legal work concerned. Because Mrs. Emmett had her own opinions about Caleb Thornton that she had been keeping to herself for several years, and was quietly glad to see becoming someone else's problem to handle. Elena divided her time between the ranch and Cross's temporary office, carrying documents, answering questions, and in several instances locating additional records that Cross needed and that the county records office produced with varying degrees of cooperation, depending on which clerk was on duty. Pruitt came in for his deposition on a Thursday. He was visibly uncomfortable and visibly relieved at the same time, which Elena understood as the particular emotional combination of someone finally doing the right thing after a long time of not doing it. Cross walked him through the survey, the baseline reference, the pressure he had been under, and the nature of the commission that had directed his work. Pruitt answered every question in full without evasion and signed the deposition when it was complete. Mercer arrived from Billings on a Saturday, thinner than Elena had imagined from his letter, and with the tentative posture of a man who wasn't certain of his welcome. Silas met him at the wagon without visible anger, which Elena thought was either genuine equanimity or a very controlled performance of it, and possibly both. Mercer shook Silas's hand and said he was sorry, and Silas said he'd done the right thing in coming, which was true and which closed that subject without requiring anything further from either of them. Mercer's deposition took 2 hours. He described the arrangement in detail: the man's appearance, his manner, the folder, the envelope, the explanation that had been plausible enough to accept. When Cross showed him the county assessor's report with its schedule of Thomas Reed's operational patterns, Mercer read it and went very pale and said quietly, "He always knew. He always knew exactly when Mr. Reed was away. I thought he had contacts in town. He had a county document," Cross said. Mercer set the report down carefully. "I didn't know," he said. "I want that understood. I didn't know what it was for." "It will be understood," Cross said. "That's what your testimony establishes." 2 days before the injunction hearing, Caleb Thornton made his move. He did not make it personally. He sent a man one of the hands from his ranch, a large and unhurried man named Decker, who was known around Harlow Creek as the person the Thornton used for errands that required a physical presence rather than a verbal one. Decker arrived at the Reed Ranch on a Monday afternoon when Silas was in town and Elena was alone with Molly. Elena heard the horse. She had the composition book in her hands, and she set it down and was at the front window before Decker reached the porch steps. She assessed one-man horse, no visible weapon in hand. She moved to the hallway where Silas's rifle was kept on its pegs and took it down, checked that it was loaded, and went back to the window. Decker knocked. She opened the door with the rifle in her right hand, barrel pointed at the porch floor. Decker looked at the rifle. Then he looked at her. He had the professional impassiveness of a man paid not to react. "Mr. Thornton sends his regards," Decker said. "He wants you to know he bears no ill will toward you personally, given the circumstances of your arrival." "That's kind of him," Elena said. "He also wanted me to let you know that the legal proceedings you're involved in are going to be complicated, expensive, and that a woman in your position, with a child to consider, might find a quiet resolution more practical than a public one." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He's authorized me to offer you a travel sum, enough to get you and the girl back east comfortably, with something left over." Elena looked at the envelope. She looked at Decker. She looked at the envelope again. "Tell Mr. Thornton," she said, in the same conversational tone she might use to relay a message about a fence repair, "that I've reviewed the property records, the survey documents, the account ledgers, and the business registrations, and that what I found in them is going to be presented to a territorial court in 2 days, along with the testimony of the 2 witnesses and the documentation summary I've prepared." Decker waited, envelope extended. "Tell him also," Elena continued, "that if he sends anyone to this property again, for any reason, without Silas Reed's explicit invitation, I will document that visit as evidence of intimidation and present it to the court as additional support for the pattern of conduct I'm establishing." She held Decker's gaze. Decker pulled the envelope back. He looked at her for a moment longer, reassessing, she thought, in the way he'd been instructed to observe and report back. Then he nodded, once turned, and walked back to his horse. Elena stood at the door until he was off the property. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with both hands on the rifle and her heart going somewhat faster than she would have preferred. Molly appeared in the doorway of the spare room. She had heard the knock clearly and had done what Elena had told her to do, stayed in the room, stayed quiet, and waited. "Is it okay?" Molly said. "Yes," Elena said. She put the rifle back on its pegs with steady hands. "It's okay. Come help me start dinner." Molly came, and Elena put her to work tearing bread for a pot of soup they didn't particularly need yet, because having Molly nearby and occupied was better than the alternative, and because the tearing of bread was a task that required enough attention to keep small hands busy. Silas came home an hour later. Elena told him what had happened in the same straightforward way. She told him everything: the knock, the offer, the message she had sent back, all of it in sequence without drama or omission. She watched his face do something she had learned to read as controlled fury, a very specific tightening around the eyes and the stillness that preceded movement. "He'll try something else," Silas said. "I know," she said, "but not before Wednesday. He can't do anything before the hearing without making it worse for himself." "You're sure?" "A man doesn't send an envelope if he's confident in his legal position," she said. "He sends an envelope when he's starting to believe the legal position might not hold." The offer was an assessment, not a threat. "He wanted to know how frightened I was. And he found out," Silas said. "He found out," she agreed. Silas looked at her for a moment. It was a different kind of looking than the early days of her being here, less assessment, less the careful evaluation of an unknown variable. It was something quieter than that, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things she was not yet sure how to deal with, by cataloging it and moving on. "The hearing is in 2 days," she said. "I need to review the timeline with Cross one more time tonight." "I'll drive you in after dinner," Silas said. "Thank you." Turned toward the stove. "Is that soup?" "Molly's been working on it," Elena said. Silas looked at Molly, who was now stirring the pot with the focused energy of someone who had been assigned a meaningful task. "How's it coming?" he said. "It needs more salt," Molly said with great authority. "She's probably right," Silas said, and found the salt. The night before the hearing, Elena sat at the table alone and read through the complete timeline from beginning to end. Not to check for errors, she had checked it enough times that she could have recited it forward and back, but because she needed to know that it held, that every link in the chain connected to the next, that every document supported every claim, that the shape of what she had built was sound enough to withstand what was coming. It was. She closed the composition book and put her hands flat on the cover and sat with that knowledge for a moment. She thought about the platform at Harlow Creek Station, which felt like something that had happened to a different woman in a different season, though it had been only weeks ago. She thought about the woman in the green shawl and the station master's apologetic face and the 22 words that had been intended to end her. Thought about Caleb Thornton riding slowly past the property, looking at the house with the deliberate patience of a man who considered patience a form of power. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had died not knowing his accounts had been manipulated. About the Drummonds who had lost their homestead, the Nolan family and their water rights, the widow Beaumont who had sold under distress and gone to her sister in Oregon. Elena opened the composition book again, and on the last page wrote a single line. Every purchase who signed their name to something dishonest still had to look at themselves in the morning. Then she closed it, blew out the lamp, and went to sleep. She slept better than she had expected. The hearing was tomorrow, and she was ready. And whatever Caleb Thornton's lawyers had prepared for her, it was not going to be as thorough as what she had prepared for them. The injunction hearing was held in the Harlow Creek Territorial Courtroom, which was a room that had been designed for other purposes and converted with minimal enthusiasm. The benches were mismatched. The windows faced west, which meant the afternoon light came in at an angle that made it difficult to read documents without squinting. The judge's bench was elevated by approximately 4 inches, just enough to suggest authority without committing to it fully. Judge Orrin Bassett had ridden in from the district seat the night before and was staying at Mrs. Emmett's, a detail Elena had noted with quiet satisfaction when she arrived at the Harlow house that morning to collect Cross, and found the judge eating breakfast in the front room with the focused attention of a man who considered a good meal a professional necessity. Bassett was 60, compact, and had the expression of someone who had heard a great many things in courtrooms and had learned to wait until all of them were said before deciding what he thought. He was not from Harlow Creek. He had no contract renewal to protect, no county board seat to maintain, no donation from Caleb Thornton funding the wall of any building he cared about. This mattered. The courtroom filled faster than Elena had anticipated. She had expected a procedural hearing with moderate local interest. What arrived instead was the better part of Harlow Creek ranchers, merchants, two women from the church auxiliary who sat in the second row with their hands folded and their expressions carefully neutral, and in the back, standing against the wall because all the seats were taken, a cluster of younger men whose presence Elena read as Thornton's, positioned to observe and report back. Thornton himself sat at the opposing table, with two lawyers she had not seen before, one older, with the practiced calm of a man who charged substantial fees and expected the room to know it, and one younger who carried the document cases and radiated the particular tension of someone who had been given an important assignment and was determined to demonstrate they deserved it. Thornton did not look at Elena when she came in. He looked at the judge's bench, at the wall, at his lawyers. The deliberate avoidance was itself a statement. She understood a performance of dismissal for the benefit of the room. She sat down beside Cross and put the composition book on the table and did not look at Thornton either. Cross leaned toward her slightly. "The lead attorney is a man named Prescott Hale," he said quietly. "He practices out of Miles City. He's good." "How good?" "Good enough that we shouldn't underestimate him." "I wasn't planning to," she said. The hearing began. Cross presented the injunction motion in the precise, methodical way Elena had come to associate with him. No rhetorical embellishment, no reaching for effect, just the clear sequential presentation of why the foreclosure should be halted pending investigation. He introduced the ledger evidence, the survey discrepancy, and the existence of two witnesses whose depositions had been taken and were available for the court's review. Hale rose to pose with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed this argument and knew exactly which parts of it would land. The loan against the Reed property was properly executed, properly recorded, and properly defaulted upon. The boundary survey was a legitimate administrative correction. The witnesses, a man who had kept books under somewhat irregular circumstances, and a county surveyor of admitted inconsistency, were compromised and unreliable. Then he said, "Furthermore, Your Honor, the court should understand the context in which this motion has been generated. Primary individual behind this challenge is a woman named Elena Hartwell, who arrived in Harlow Creek several weeks ago as a mail-order bride arranged by Mr. Thornton himself. When Mr. Thornton exercised his right to cancel that arrangement, Mrs. Hartwell, a widow with limited resources and no local connections, chose to remain in the territory and involve herself in Mr. Reed's legal affairs. The court should weigh accordingly whether this challenge represents genuine evidence of fraud or whether it represents something considerably more personal." The room shifted. Elena felt it a collective intake and rebalance, the quiet recalibration of people who were being offered a narrative they could understand and might find easier to believe than the alternative. She kept her face still. Judge Bassett looked over his glasses at Hale. "Counselors, the motivation of parties who provide evidence doesn't typically determine its admissibility." "Of course, Your Honor. I raise it only for context." "Noted, Mr. Cross." Cross stood. "Your Honor, we welcome the court's examination of Mrs. Hartwell's motivation because it supports our position. Mrs. Hartwell arrived in Montana with no knowledge of the Reed property or its circumstances. It was only after her arrival at the Reed Ranch a consequence, not a design, that she examined the financial records in the course of providing accounting assistance. What she found was not manufactured by grievance. It was found because someone put it there years before Mrs. Hartwell ever heard of Harlow Creek." He paused. "The question before the court is not why Mrs. Hartwell looked at the ledgers. It's what the ledgers say." Bassett looked between the two attorneys with the expression of a man filing everything away for later. "I'll review the depositions and the documentation. I'll also hear from the witnesses directly. We'll reconvene after the noon recess." Pruitt testified first in the afternoon. He sat in the witness chair with the contained discomfort of someone performing a necessary unpleasantness and determined to get through it with what remained of his dignity. Cross walked him through the survey, the baseline reference, the pressure he had been under, with the same patient methodology he had used in the deposition. Pruitt answered everything in full. When he described being given the reference point by an outside party who had told him it was independently verified, his voice was steady, but his hands were not, and Elena thought that the visible discomfort was probably more persuasive than a composed performance would have been. Hale's cross-examination was surgical. He established that Pruitt had conducted the survey voluntarily, that he had signed his name to it, that he was a professional whose expertise was supposed to include independent verification. He did not ask Pruitt who had pressured him. He asked instead whether Pruitt could produce at this moment any documentation of the outside pressure he claimed to have experienced. Pruitt could not. "So your testimony," Hale said pleasantly, "is that you conducted an inaccurate survey because someone unidentified, undocumented told you to, and you signed your professional name to it. And you didn't mention this to anyone for 2 years, until a woman with a grievance against the defendant came to your office." Pruitt started. "Thank you," Hale said. "No further questions." Cross was on his feet. "Redirect, Your Honor." "Mr. Pruitt, the county assessor's report from 1883, the one documenting Thomas Reed's operational schedule as part of Caleb Thornton's grazing application. Were you aware that report existed before Mrs. Hartwell brought it to your attention?" "No," Pruitt said. "And when you saw it, the detailed schedule of when Thomas Reed was and wasn't on his own property, did that correspond to anything in your recollection of the circumstances surrounding your survey?" Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. "The man who gave me the baseline reference," he said. "He knew when I could come to the property without encountering Reed directly. He arranged for me to conduct the survey on a Tuesday when Reed was in town." He paused. "I remember thinking at the time that it was odd that he knew Reed's schedule that specifically." "Thank you," Cross said. No further questions. Hale's expression when Elena looked at him had shifted by approximately 2 degrees in a direction that was not entirely comfortable. He had not anticipated the assessor's report. He knew it, and she knew he knew it, and the exchange established something that his surgical cross-examination of Pruitt had not been able to fully undo. Mercer was called next. He was more nervous than Pruitt and less practiced at concealing it, which meant he sat in the witness chair with his hands clasped on his knees and a visible determination not to let that nervousness become evasion. He answered Cross's questions in the straightforward, sequential way of his letter, and when he described the man who had delivered the payments, the good boots, the leather folder, the knowledge of Thomas Reed's schedule, the room was very still. Hale's cross-examination of Mercer was harder than his treatment of Pruitt. He established that Mercer had made the entries voluntarily, that he had accepted money, that he had not told Thomas Reed what he was doing, that he had left the territory rather than coming forward when the foreclosure notice arrived. "You left," Hale said. "When things got complicated, when the man you say you worked for died, and his son was facing foreclosure, you left for Billings." "Yes," Mercer said, "because you were involved in something you knew was wrong." I wasn't sure what it was," Mercer said. His voice had the quality of someone telling an uncomfortable truth about himself, because the comfortable version was no longer available. "I thought maybe I should say something, and then I thought maybe it wasn't what I was worried about, and then I just left." "I know that wasn't right." "No," Hale agreed, "it wasn't. And now you've come back, at the request of a woman who needed witnesses." "I came back because someone is losing their property to something I helped with, even if I didn't understand what it was," Mercer said. His voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "I'm not proud of any of it. But I'm here." There was something in the room after he said that, not approval, exactly, but a quality of listening that was different from before. Elena had been watching the faces of the ranchers in the benches, the men and women who had been part of this community long enough to have accumulated opinions about what honesty looked like when it cost something. She saw some of them exchange looks. Hale did not redirect. He sat down. Cross stood. "Your Honor, we request the court's consideration of the County Assessor's Report Exhibit 7 in conjunction with the testimony just given. The report establishes that Caleb Thornton's ranch filed a grazing application in March 1883 requiring documentation of Thomas Reed's operational schedule. That documentation was produced by a county assessor and became part of the official county record. The first payment recorded by Mr. Mercer under the direction of an outside party, a payment to Frontier Meridian Holdings, appeared in the Reed Ranch accounts in June 1883, 2 months after that schedule was compiled. The court is asked to consider whether that sequence is coincidental." Bassett looked at Exhibit 7 for a long time. Then he looked at Thornton's table. "Mr. Hale, Is your client prepared to address the business registration of Frontier Meridian Holdings and its relationship to Consolidated Rangeland Partners? Hale stood with the composure of a man who had prepared for this question and did not like having to answer it. Your Honor, Frontier Meridian Holdings is a legitimate registered business entity. Its activities are lawful commercial operations. The fact that the registered agent for that entity also appears on a subsequent business registration is a matter of standard business practice. Registered agents serve multiple clients. There is no demonstrated connection between either entity and Mr. Thornton personally. There is a demonstrated connection, Cross said, rising, between the timing of Frontier Meridian Holdings payments to the Reed Ranch and the operational schedule compiled under Mr. Thornton's county application. The court is being asked to find that coincidental. We submit that it is not. Bassett took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, which Elena had noticed he did when he was thinking, rather than when his glasses actually needed cleaning. I'm going to grant the injunction, he said. Thornton's table went very still. The foreclosure proceeding against the Reed property is halted pending full evidentiary review, Bassett continued. I'm also referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation of potential fraud, given the pattern of documentation presented today. He looked at Hale. I'd recommend your client make himself available for that process. Hale began to say something. Bassett raised one hand slightly, and Hale stopped. Court is recessed, Bassett said. The room did not empty the way courtrooms usually emptied, with the gradual dispersal of people whose interest has been formally concluded. It emptied slowly, in clusters, with the quality of a crowd that had absorbed something large and was still processing it. Elena stayed seated while the benches cleared. Cross was making notes beside her. Silas stood at the end of their table with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who had just watched something he had believed was impossible become possible, and who was not yet sure how to rearrange his understanding of what was real. Molly was at Mrs. Emmett's, which Elena had arranged that morning, because she had not known what the day would bring, and had not wanted Molly in a courtroom for any of it. When Cross had asked why she seemed so calm arriving at the hearing, she had told him she had left her daughter with a capable woman, and that the calm was partly that. He had accepted the answer without comment. The Attorney General's referral, Elena said to Cross. What does that mean practically? It means an investigator from Helena will come to look at everything, Cross said. They'll have subpoena power. They can compel production of documents we couldn't access, bank records, business from Helena, communication records if they exist. Connection between Thornton and FMH is in those records. They'll find it. He capped his pen. The injunction gives us the ranch. The referral gives us the possibility of something larger. The other families, Elena said. Yes, she nodded. She thought about the Drummonds, the Nolan family, the widow Beaumont. She thought about them not knowing, wherever they were now, that the machine that had taken their land had begun to crack. Thornton had already left the courtroom. She had not seen him go, which told her the departure had been deliberate, slipping out while the attention in the room was elsewhere, which was a very specific kind of exit made by people who did not want to be seen making it. His lawyers were at the back of the room, speaking to each other in low voices. Hale glanced toward the plaintiff's table. Once it was a brief look, professional and unreadable, and then looked away. He'll appeal, Cross said. I know, Elena said. The referral complicates an appeal. If the Attorney General's investigation turns up direct evidence of Thornton's involvement with FMH, the fraud case isn't just a civil matter anymore. He gathered the documents into his case. He may decide the cost of appealing is higher than the cost of settlement. I don't want a settlement, Elena said. I want the other families made whole. Cross looked at her over his glasses. That's the Attorney General's mandate, not ours. Our mandate is the Reed property, and we've secured it. For now, she said. For now is a start. Silas had come to stand beside her. He put his hat on and looked at the judge's bench, which was empty now, and the room, which was almost clear. Thank you, he said. He said it to the room rather than to her directly, which she understood as Silas. He found direct gratitude slightly harder to manage than most things. Don't thank me yet, she said. The injunction holds the foreclosure. Doesn't reverse it. We need the full case. I know. He looked at her. But we have the injunction. We have the injunction, she agreed. 2 days after the hearing, Harlow Creek began to change. Not dramatically. Not in the way that stories later made it sound, as if a switch had been thrown and everything was different. changed the way things change in small communities when a public secret is publicly acknowledged slowly, in conversations that happened in doorways and over store counters, and at the water trough on the east side of the livery, where men gathered in the mornings to talk about things they were still deciding how to think about. The Drummond family was the first. Ray Drummond came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, hat in hand, which was not his natural posture. He was a broad, weathered man who had built a homestead from raw ground and tended to hold himself accordingly. He sat at Silas's kitchen table and he looked at Elena, who was sitting across from him with her composition book open, and he said, "We sold that property because we couldn't service a debt we didn't think we'd taken on. The loan appeared in documents we'd signed for other purposes. I want someone to explain to me if that's what you found in the Reed accounts." Elena told him what she had found. She showed him the relevant pages of the timeline. She watched his face move through recognition, the way faces move through recognition, when they understand that something they had accepted as their own failure was actually something that was done to them. He pressed his hand flat on the table. He was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he said. "She blamed herself. We'd had a bad year with the cattle, and when the debt appeared, she thought she assumed she'd misunderstood something about the documents. She blamed herself for 5 years. Elena kept her voice steady. She didn't misunderstand anything. The documents were manufactured. Drummond looked at her. "What do we do? Talk to Nathan Cross," she said. She wrote his name and the address of his Helena practice. "The Attorney General's investigation is going to look at other properties, but you should have your own representation. Give Cross the same information you gave me when you first saw the debt, what documents were involved, who handled the transactions." Drummond took the paper. He stood up. He looked at the table for a moment without looking at anything specifically, and then he said, "Thornton donated money for the school library." "I know," Elena said. "I helped him move the bookshelves in." He said it with a particular flatness that was more expressive than anything else he could have said. Then he put on his hat and left. The Nolan family came the following day, 2 brothers and a sister-in-law, all talking at once until Elena held up a hand gently and asked them to take turns. Their water rights had been lost in a legal dispute that had appeared to originate in an ambiguous clause in their original homestead filing. A lawyer had told them the clause was fatal to their claim. They had spent the next 3 years dry farming, which had barely worked. Elena listened to all of it. She took notes. She gave them Cross's address. When they left, she sat at the table alone for a while. Silas found her there. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the composition book, the stack of notes, the list of names she had begun building on the last page. "How many do you think there are?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Enough that I think the Attorney General's investigation is going to be larger than Cross anticipated." Silas came in and poured himself coffee and sat down. "You know the town is talking about you differently now," he said. "I'd gathered Mrs. Emmett told me she heard someone at the dry goods store describe you as that woman who took Thornton apart with a ledger." He said it without particular expression. She seemed to think it was a compliment. "It's reasonably accurate," Elena said, turned his cup in his hands. He had that look again, the pause before the sentence he wasn't sure of, and she decided she was going to let him find it at whatever pace he needed. "Property's not going anywhere," he said. "The injunction holds. Cross thinks the full case is strong." He stopped. "I've been thinking about what comes after." "After the case," she said. "After the case. After the Attorney General's investigation. After Thornton's lawyers stop appealing and the thing is finished." He looked at his coffee. "What you do after that?" Elena was quiet for a moment. Kitchens was warm. She could hear Molly outside, where the late afternoon had turned golden, and Fletcher was doing something that apparently required considerable supervision. "I haven't decided," she said. It was the honest answer. She had not decided because she had been too focused on what was immediately in front of her to look beyond it, and because looking beyond it required accepting the possibility that it would resolve, and that felt presumptuous. Silas nodded. He did not press it, which she had expected, and she was not sure whether she was relieved or something else. 3 weeks after the injunction hearing, the Attorney General's investigator arrived. His name was Callum Voss, and he was 45 years old and had the specific energy of a man who was very good at his job and found the job consistently interesting. He came with 2 assistants, a mandate from Helena, and a subpoena for the business records of Frontier Meridian Holdings, Meridian Valley Bank, and Consolidated Rangeland Partners that compelled production from Wallace Crane's office in Billings within 10 days. He also came with information. He sat at Cross's temporary office, still the front parlor at Mrs. Emmett's, which Mrs. Emmett had apparently decided was its permanent function for the duration, and he told Cross and Elena what the territorial investigation had found in its preliminary phase. Frontier Meridian Holdings was registered to Wallace Crane as agent, but the business account behind it had been opened in the name of a holding company based in Helena. The holding company's principals included two names: a man named Orson Webb, who was a minor land speculator with no notable history, and a man whose name did not appear in any of the Harlow Creek documents. His name was Caleb Thornton. He was a principal, Cross said. A minority principal, technically, Voss said. Orson Webb held the majority share. But the operational decisions, the targets, the timing, the methodology appeared to have been directed by the minority partner. He set a document on the table. We found correspondence. Letters between Thornton and Webb going back to 1882. They discuss the Reed property specifically. They discuss the survey adjustment. They discuss what Thornton calls the letter arrangement, which we believe refers to the mail order advertisement as a distraction strategy. Elena read the relevant passage in the letter Voss indicated. Thornton's handwriting was nothing like the careful, warm script of the letters he had sent her. It was angular and abbreviated, the handwriting of a man writing for himself rather than an audience. He had written, "The woman's arrival will create the necessary noise. Ensure the foreclosure paperwork moves while the town is watching the station." She set the document down. "He planned it from the start," she said. "From at least 8 months before your correspondence began," Voss said. "The advertisement was placed approximately 6 months before your arrival. He began targeting you, specifically your responses to the advertisement, when your letters indicated financial competence and a professional background. You were selected because you seemed capable enough to be convincing and desperate enough not to look too hard." The room was very quiet. Cross looked at Elena. She looked at the letter. She looked at the handwriting. She thought about the careful, warm letters she had received, the voice that had seemed sincere, the description of a comfortable life in Montana that she had let herself imagine step by step over 6 months of correspondence. "He chose me because I seemed competent," she said. "Yes," Voss said. "And then I was." Voss looked at her. Something in his professional expression relaxed by a degree. Considerably more than he anticipated, yes. She closed the composition book, picked up her pen and set it down. She was feeling something that was not quite anger, and not quite satisfaction, and not quite grief, but some compound of all three that didn't have a name she knew. Something about being precisely accurate and terribly wrong at the same time, the way she had read the advertisement and believed it, and the way the belief had led her, by completely unintended paths, to the right place. "The letters," she said. "The ones he wrote me. Will they be part of the prosecution case?" "The fraud case doesn't necessarily need them," Vossa said. "But they establish premeditation in the broader pattern. Prosecutor may find them useful." "Use them," she said. Cross looked at her. She met his gaze. "Use them," she said again. Every word. The news that the Attorney General's investigation had produced direct documentary evidence connecting Thornton to Frontier Meridian Holdings moved through Harlow Creek in the specific way that information moves through a small community that has been holding its breath fast and completely in approximately 24 hours. Elena had not been the one to tell anyone, but Cross had made the appropriate disclosures to the relevant parties in the appropriate legal contexts, and appropriate legal contexts had walls with ears, and within a day of Voss's visit to Mrs. Emmett's front parlor, the information was common knowledge. What changed was difficult to measure precisely. There was no single moment. The woman in the green shawl stopped across the street from Elena on the main road on a Friday morning and said, stiffly but directly, "I was unkind to you when you arrived. I want to say I wasn't right to be." And then she walked on before Elena could decide how to respond. Which was perhaps better. Elena was not sure she had a response available that was both honest and gracious simultaneously, and the woman had already gone. Harlan Colt, the bank manager at Meridian Valley Bank, came to Cross's office not with an attorney but alone, which Voss had specifically noted as significant. He sat down and told Cross, in the measured tones of a man who had been keeping something uncomfortable in a small space for too long, that he had known the loan document in Thomas Reed's name was not genuine. He had known it when it was presented to him. He had been shown a separate document, a letter from Thornton's attorneys that he had understood as a threat to his license if he did not process the loan as presented. "I processed it," Cole said. I knew what it was, and I processed it. I have not slept correctly since. He had brought copies of the threat letter. He had been keeping them, he said, because he had believed that a document like that was the only protection he had if things ever reached this point. Cross took the copies with the careful hands of a man receiving something fragile. Voss, who had been present at the meeting, said very little. He wrote one line in his notebook and put it in his pocket. After Cole left, Cross looked at the table in front of him, at the accumulation of documents that had been building there for weeks. The bank withdrawal from the foreclosure is coming, he said. When? Elena said. By the end of the week, I'd estimate. Cole's statement makes the foreclosure indefensible. The bank's own manager has confirmed the loan was fraudulent. There's no legal mechanism to continue. Elena absorbed that. And Thornton, she said. The Attorney General's case is built enough that Voss will recommend prosecution, Cross said. Whether the territorial prosecutor moves forward depends on the strength of the direct evidence. The letters, Cole's testimony, the registration documents, it's a strong case. Not a certain one, but strong. The other families, Elena said. The Drummond property was acquired by Consolidated Rangeland Partners under a transaction that uses the same documentation pattern as the Reed forgery. The Nolan water rights were obtained through a legal dispute that Cross's investigation has connected to an attorney billing through the Webb's office. Cross paused. The civil restoration proceedings will take time. Structure is there. Elena looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming in at the westward angle she had gotten used to, the particular gold of Montana autumn that was beautiful in a way that still surprised her sometimes. She thought about what Voss had said, selected because you seemed capable enough to be convincing and desperate enough not to look too hard. She had not looked hard enough. She had answered an advertisement with care and diligence and hope, and she had not looked hard enough at the man behind it, because looking hard would have required believing that a man could be that specific and that deliberate in his cruelty. She had learned. She would not make that particular mistake again. But she had also not run when she should have been too beaten to stay. She had not left when leaving was the path of least resistance, when leaving was what everyone had expected a rejected mail-order bride, with nowhere to go and no resources and a 5-year-old daughter to do. She had stayed, and she had worked, and she had built a case from paper and ink and the testimonies of imperfect people who had done wrong things, and then, when it mattered, done right ones. It was not how she would have chosen to build a life, but it was what she had built. Cross was gathering documents. Voss was closing his notebook. The afternoon was moving toward evening, and she needed to get back to the ranch, where Silas would be finishing the fence on the north line, and Molly would be somewhere in the vicinity of Fletcher, providing ongoing operational commentary. Picked up the composition book. She stood, Mrs. Hartwell, Voss said. He said it with the particular tone of a government official who had something personal to and was deciding whether to say it in a professional context. He decided to. The letters he sent you, he said. The advertisement. The 6 months of correspondence. What he did using someone's hope that way. It matters to the case as evidence of premeditation, but I want you to know it also matters beyond the case. Elena looked at him. He specifically selected someone who wanted a better life, Voss said, and used that wanting against them. That's not just fraud. It's something else that the law doesn't have a precise word for. No, Elena said, it doesn't. She put on her coat, picked up her bag. I'll be at the ranch if you need me, she said, and walked out into the cold Montana afternoon, with her composition book under her arm and her step, for the first time in weeks, something lighter than functional, not free of weight. She was not someone who confused lightness with weightlessness, but lighter. The difference between carrying something and carrying something that was beginning at last to be understood. The wagon was at the rail. Silas was at the reins waiting. He did not ask how it went. He looked at her face as she climbed up and read whatever was there, and then he turned the horse toward home. Cole came forward, she said. I heard. The foreclosure will be withdrawn by the end of the week. Silas was quiet for a moment. My father, he said. Then he stopped. He started again. He stopped again. I know, Elena said. They drove the 4 miles in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The light was going gold across the ridges, and Fletcher would be waiting at the barn, and Molly would have approximately 12 things she wanted to say the moment the wagon came through the gate. The Reed Ranch came into view around the last bend. The fencing on the south line was new. Silas had finished it while she was in town. She could see the line of clean posts running straight where they had sagged before. The house needed paint on the north-facing wall, and the porch board second from the right was still soft and would need replacing before winter. It was imperfect and cold and enormous work. It was, she realized, with the particular accuracy of a woman who had learned to read the truth in numbers, beginning to feel like hers. The foreclosure withdrawal came on a Friday. Cross brought the document to the ranch himself, which Elena had not expected. She had anticipated a letter, or a notice delivered through the county clerk's office, the formal and impersonal machinery of legal process completing its cycle. Instead, Cross rode out in the late morning with the papers in his case, and tied his horse at the rail and knocked. And when Elena opened the door, he handed her a single sheet and said, "It's done." She read it standing in the doorway. The Meridian Valley Bank, citing irregularities in the origination of the loan instrument, formally withdrew its foreclosure action against the Reed property. The debt was voided. The deed remained with Silas Reed, unencumbered. She read it twice. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." Silas was at the table when she handed him the paper. He read it the way he read most things, completely, without rushing, without the performance of reaction. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the window for a moment. The light outside was pale and early, coming off frost on the ground that had not yet burned away. He said, "It's over." "This part," Elena said. "The criminal case is still moving. The civil restorations for the other families will take months. This, the ranch, yes. This part is over." Silas nodded, kept looking at the window. Cross sat down across from him. "I want to explain what happens next with Thornton," he said, "because I don't want you to be blindsided by the pace of it." Silas looked at him. "The Attorney General's prosecution is proceeding," Cross said. "Voss has filed his recommendation. The evidence is substantial: the letters, the registration documents, Cole's testimony, the pattern across multiple properties. But territorial criminal prosecution takes time. Thornton has resources and he'll use them. His lawyers will file motions. There will be delays." He paused. "He's not going to walk into a courtroom next week and come out in handcuffs. It won't look like that." "What will it look like?" Silas said. "It will look like a man whose operation has been exposed and who is spending considerable money and time trying to limit the damage. His county board seat is already effectively finished. 3 of the 5 board members have quietly distanced themselves from him since Voss's investigation became public. His cattle buyers from Billings canceled 2 contracts last month. People who were dependent on his favor are reassessing that dependency." Cross folded his hands on the table. "Prosecution will take its course. But the collapse of his influence that's happening now, that's already done." Silas absorbed this. "My father," he said. It came out differently than when he had tried to say it in the wagon. On the way home from town, more complete, less stopped. Spent 20 years on this property. He built it from raw ground. He didn't deserve to die thinking he'd left a debt for me to manage." He was quiet for a moment. "I want it on record somewhere that the debt wasn't his." "It will be," Cross said. "The voiding of the loan instrument is a public record. Anyone who looks at the Reed property title from this point forward will see that the foreclosure was withdrawn on grounds of fraud. Record says what happened." Silas nodded. He picked up the withdrawal notice and read it one more time, and then set it down with a careful deliberateness, like a man placing something in its proper position. "Thank you," he said to Cross. He said it directly, which cost him something visible, and Cross received it with equal directness. "Mrs. Hartwell built the case," Cross said. "I filed the papers." Silas looked at Elena. She had been standing near the kitchen counter, giving the 2 of them the table, and he looked at her with the particular look she had been cataloging for weeks, without allowing herself to fully interpret. She met it evenly. "I know what you did," Silas said. "I know you do," she said. "Go tell Molly. She's been waiting for news since breakfast." He almost smiled. He went. The weeks that followed were not triumphant in any clean sense. Triumph in real life rarely was. The Attorney General's case moved forward in the grinding. Administrative way of legal proceedings motions filed, motions answered, hearings scheduled and rescheduled, Thornton's lawyers finding procedural ground to contest at every turn. Voss came back to Harlow Creek twice more, each time with questions that required Elena's documentation and her memory of specific details in specific ledgers on specific pages, and she answered everything with the same methodical patience she had brought to the original investigation. Thornton was not arrested, not yet, not in the weeks immediately following. He remained on his property, which had become something of a fortress of withdrawal, fewer hands, fewer visitors, the gates that had always stood open now more often closed. The man who had been a fixture at every market day and harvest gathering was no longer present at either. The town noticed. The town had opinions about what it noticed, and the opinions were on balance, not in Thornton's favor. Ray Drummond's claim was formally filed with the territorial court in November, supported by documentation that Elena had helped him organize over 3 evenings at his kitchen table while his wife set out coffee and did not leave the room, listening, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wife's name was Agnes, and she had a contained, precise way of speaking that suggested a woman who had learned to measure her words carefully in a household that had been under financial strain for years. When Elena finished presenting the timeline of what had been done to them, Agnes was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I told Ray for 5 years that I should have read the papers more carefully before he signed them." "Papers were designed to look routine," Elena said. "The fraud was in the origination, not the documents you saw." Agnes looked at her. "You're saying I wasn't foolish." "You were presented with something false that was made to appear true," Elena said. "That's not foolishness, that's being lied to." Agnes pressed her lips together. She picked up the coffee pot and refilled Elena's cup and Ray's cup, and then set the pot down and stood at the counter with her back to both of them for a moment. "All right," she said, when she turned back around. "What do we sign?" The Nolan brothers' claim followed a week later. Their situation was more complex. The water rights dispute had involved multiple county documents, and untangling the legitimate filings from the manipulated ones required the kind of sustained attention to detail that Elena had, by this point, developed into something close to a professional instinct. She spent 4 days on their documentation alone, working at the kitchen table at the Reed Ranch in the evenings after Molly was in bed, with Silas sometimes across from her reading or repairing something small, and the house settling into the sounds of late autumn around them. He had stopped asking whether she needed anything and had started simply leaving things a cup of coffee at her elbow when she'd been working too long, a lamp trimmed when she hadn't noticed it was low, a plate of something hot when she'd missed the point at which dinner had been served and eaten, and the kitchen cleaned up around her. She noticed, she did not comment on it. Some things were better acknowledged by receiving them without making a production of the receipt. The Harvest Festival arrived in the 3rd week of October. Elena had not planned to attend. She was aware that her public presence at community events was now a different proposition than it had been in the early weeks. She was no longer the abandoned mail-order bride, the cautionary story, the object of visible pity or gossip. She was something else now, something the town was still finding the right category for. She was not sure she wanted to stand in the middle of that process. Molly, who had no such reservations and had been informed of the Harvest Festival's existence by Fletcher's general excitement about unusual outdoor activity, had a firm position on the matter. "I want to go," Molly said. She said it at breakfast, in the tone she used for matters of principle rather than preference. "We'll see," Elena said, which Molly correctly interpreted as insufficient resistance. Silas looked at Elena over his coffee. "It might be worth going," he said. "People have questions for you that they've been waiting to ask in a setting that feels appropriate. Festival is easier than a doorstep." "You want me to be available," she said. "I want you to have the option," he said, with the careful accuracy he used when he was choosing words. "It's different." They went. The festival was held in the field beside the grain cooperative tables and lanterns, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn, children running without particular direction, dogs of ambiguous ownership weaving between the table legs. The sound of it hit Elena first, before the sight, the particular layered noise of people who had known each other a long time, gathered by habit and season. Molly released her mother's hand approximately 8 seconds after they arrived, and was absorbed into a cluster of children near the bonfire before Elena could form a sentence. "She'll be fine," Silas said. "I know," Elena said. She did know. Molly had, over the past several weeks, developed a social network at the Reed ranches surrounding properties that Elena had not fully tracked, built from an apparently universal 5-year-old fluency in finding other children, dogs, and interesting things within any given radius. They walked through the festival. People spoke to Elena differently than they had in September directly, making eye contact, some of them with the particular combination of warmth and slight awkwardness of people correcting a prior position. The dry goods store owner shook her hand. One of the church auxiliary women said she was glad the Drummond family was getting their fair hearing. A younger man she didn't recognize introduced himself as a hand from the property adjacent to the Nolans' original claim, and said that if there was anything he could tell the Attorney General's people that would help, he had things he'd seen over the past few years that he hadn't known what to do with. Elena gave him Voss's name and wrote the contact information on a page that Voss, as he had started his carrying through, after the composition book filled up. She was on her second page of the evening when she looked up and found Caleb Thornton across the field. He was standing at the edge of the festival, at the place where the lantern light thinned and the dark began, and he was looking at her. Not the slow, deliberate assessment of the man who had ridden past the ranch in September, building a picture of her fear. This was something different. He looked like a man standing in a place he had always considered his own, watching it become unfamiliar. Their eyes met across the field. Elena did not look away. She held it not aggressively, not theatrically, just steadily, the way she held everything she had decided not to flinch from. She was aware of Silas beside her, of the notebook in her hand, of the lantern light and the festival sounds around her. Thornton looked away first. He turned and walked into the dark at the edge of the field and did not come back. Silas, who had been watching the exchange without speaking, said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's the first time I've seen him back down from anything." "People back down," Elena said, "when they finally understand what they're looking at." Closed the notebook. The territorial court issued its full ruling 6 weeks after the injunction hearing. The fraud finding was comprehensive. The court determined that the loan instrument in Thomas Reed's name was a forgery, that the boundary survey adjustment had been conducted using a falsified reference point commissioned for that purpose, and that the pattern of conduct across multiple properties constituted a coordinated scheme to defraud landowners of their property through manufactured debt and manipulated legal processes. The Reed property's title was formally cleared of all encumbrances. The boundary was restored to its 1,878 survey lines, returning the creek to the eastern edge of the property where it had always belonged. The water came back. Silas stood at the eastern fence on the morning after the ruling and looked at the creek running where it was supposed to run, which it had been doing all along, but which the law now agreed was his. Elena stood beside him. It was cold. The kind of cold that meant winter was no longer approaching but arriving, and their breath showed in the air, and the creek ran clear and indifferent over the rocks. The way water ran regardless of what the legal documents said about who owned the land it crossed. "My father used to come out here in the mornings," Silas said. "He said it was the best part of the property. The sound of it." Elena listened. It was a good sound, clean and continuous, the sound of something that had not been stopped, only briefly disputed. "He was right," she said. Silas looked at her. He had that expression again, the one she had been cataloging all these weeks, and had finally allowed herself to interpret, because the evidence had become too consistent to ignore, and she had always trusted evidence over intuition. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I'm not," he stopped. Tried again. "I'm not good at this particular kind of conversation. I want you to know that before I have it, so you're not measuring what I say against how someone else might say it." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm not either. Go ahead." He looked at the creek. "You came here to marry someone," he said. "That's a fact. The someone turned out to be a fraud, and the marriage turned out to be a trap, and what happened instead was this." He gestured vaguely at the property around them, at the house behind them, at the whole improbable sequence of events. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere better to go. I've watched you for months, and I know that's not what I'm asking. You could go anywhere. You could do this for anyone. You don't need this ranch or this county, or—" He stopped. "You don't need me." "No," she agreed, "I don't." He absorbed that. "But needing and wanting are different things," she said. She had not planned to say it that simply, but it was what was true, and she had always been a woman who trusted the plain truth over the elaborated version. "I came west looking for a practical arrangement. I was willing to build something honest with a man I barely knew because I understood that most good things are built rather than found." She paused. "What I found here was already built, or most of it. The foundation was already here. You were already here." She looked at the creek. "I want to stay, not because I have to, because this is where the work I care about is, and because Molly has named the dog, and because," she stopped. "'Cause?" he said. "Because when I wake up in the morning and hear you moving around in the kitchen, I don't feel like a guest anymore," she said. "And I haven't for a while." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran. The cold settled around them. "I'd like to ask you to marry me," he said carefully. "But I want you to know that what I'm asking for isn't a housekeeper or an accountant or someone to fill the space my father's death left. I'm asking because you're the most, because I haven't. He stopped again, with the frustrated look of a man whose vocabulary was failing him on a matter of importance. Silas, she said, yes, ask me. He looked at her directly the way he looked at things he was certain of. Will you marry me? Yes, Elena said. It was not a dramatic moment. Creek continued at the same volume. The cold did not relent. Neither of them moved toward the other in any sudden or cinematic way. He reached out and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the fence rail, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that was all, and it was enough. They married in December, in Mrs. Emmett's front parlor, which had by then hosted enough of the significant events of the preceding months that it seemed appropriate. Cross was there, having extended his stay in Harlow Creek for reasons that had gradually shifted from professional to personal. He had begun taking meals with Mrs. Emmett and had stopped discussing when he was returning to Helena. Pruitt came, which Elena had not expected and was genuinely glad of. Mercer came from Billings, thinner than before, but with a settled quality he had not had in September, the look of a man who had done a difficult thing and was living more comfortably inside himself as a result. The Drummonds came. Agnes brought a pie. Ray shook Silas's hand for a long time without either of them saying anything, which said everything. Molly wore her good dress and held Fletcher's collar throughout the proceedings. Having negotiated the dog's inclusion with a combination of logic and persistence that Elena found, in retrospect, she should have seen coming. The ceremony was brief and straightforward. No performance. Elena said what she meant. Silas said what he meant, which was less than Elena said but carried the same weight. When it was done, they stood together in Mrs. Emmett's front parlor with their friends around them, and Molly's hand in Silas's and the winter outside making the windows rattle slightly. And Elena thought, this is what I came for. Not this exactly, but this. Caleb Thornton was formally charged by the territorial prosecutor in January. The charges included forgery, fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and suborning perjury, the last count relating to Warren Gale's representation of the Drummond family, which the investigation had connected to a payment from Consolidated Rangeland Partners that had not been disclosed to the Drummonds. His lawyers filed 3 motions to dismiss. All 3 were denied. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Elena gave testimony in a deposition that lasted 2 days, presenting the documentation she had built from the Reed Ranch ledgers outward, the complete architecture of what she had found and how she had found it. She was asked once, by Thornton's lead attorney, whether her findings might have been influenced by personal grievance against the defendant. She looked at the attorney across the deposition table. I came to Montana with the intention of marrying a man I had corresponded with for 6 months, she said. When I arrived, he rejected me publicly, at the station, in front of witnesses, and sent me away with a 22-word letter. If my feelings toward him were the product of personal grievance, I would have left Montana that same day and never thought about him again. She paused. I stayed because the financial records I was asked to examine showed evidence of fraud. My feelings about Caleb Thornton are not relevant to what the ledgers say. The ledgers say what they say, regardless of whether I like him. The attorney wrote something on his pad and did not ask the question again. The Drummond property was restored by civil order the following spring, coinciding with the opening of Thornton's criminal trial. Agnes Drummond walked back through the door of her farmhouse for the first time in 3 years and stood in the empty front room, stripped of most of its furniture during the forced sale, and was quiet for a while. Ray stood behind her. When she turned around, her eyes were red, but her jaw was set in the expression Elena had come to associate with her, that particular compressed determination of someone who has grieved a thing and is now done grieving it and is ready to rebuild. We'll need a new table, Agnes said. We'll get one, Ray said. They did. The Nolan brothers' water rights were restored by court order that summer. The eldest brother, who had been dry farming a second property he'd acquired after losing the water access, went back to the original claim and stood at the creek that ran through it and said nothing for a long time. His brother stood beside him. His sister-in-law, who had driven the wagon, stayed on the seat and watched them and did not hurry either of them. Thornton was convicted in September. The jury deliberated for 2 days, which was longer than Cross had expected and shorter than Thornton's lawyers had hoped. The verdict covered 4 of the 6 charges. The 2 conspiracy counts were not proven to the jury's satisfaction, which Cross had told Elena was always a risk with conspiracy, given the evidentiary standard. The 4 convictions included forgery and 2 counts of fraud. The sentence was 8 years at the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. Elena was at the ranch when the telegram arrived with the verdict. Silas read it and handed it to her without comment. She read it and set it on the table and looked at the window for a long time. She was not certain what she had expected to feel. Satisfaction, maybe the clean click of a mechanism completing its cycle. What she felt instead was more complicated and more human than that. She felt the weight of the thing that had been done to the families in this county, a weight that a verdict acknowledged but did not lift. She felt something that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief but lived in the space between them, where the understanding of how much damage had been done by one man's systematic cruelty met the understanding that the damage was now finally named and answered. 8 years. For what he had done to the Reeds, the Drummonds, the Nolans, the widow Beaumont, and whoever else the investigation had not fully traced. 8 years for what he had done to Elena herself, not just the rejection at the station, but the 6 months of calculated correspondence, the deliberate selection of a woman whose hope and need could be weaponized against her. She thought about that for a while. She had thought about it, in various forms, for most of the past year. She had thought about what it meant that she had been chosen specifically because she seemed both capable and vulnerable capable, enough to be convincing, vulnerable enough not to look too hard. She had thought about how close she had come to simply leaving in those first days at the ranch, when the reasonable thing, the obviously sensible thing, was to find a way back east and put Montana behind her as a failed experiment. She was glad she had not done the reasonable thing, not because staying had been triumphant, or because the story had resolved cleanly. It had not. The Drummond table had to be replaced. Agnes Drummond had spent 3 years blaming herself for something she had no responsibility for. The Nolan brothers had lost years of water access that couldn't be returned. Thomas Reed had died not knowing the truth about what had been done to his accounts. Those things were true and would remain true regardless of the verdict. But she was glad she had stayed, because staying had meant that the records got read, and the witnesses got found, and the documents got organized into a form that a court could use. Because staying had meant that some version of justice, imperfect and slow and bureaucratically complicated as it was, had eventually arrived. There was a lesson in that, she thought. Though she was cautious about lessons, they had a tendency to oversimplify things that were genuinely complicated. But there was something true in the idea that the most useful thing she had brought to Montana was not courage or intelligence, or even the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. The most useful thing she had brought was the refusal to accept the story someone else had written for her. She had arrived as a character in Caleb Thornton's narrative. A prop, essentially the abandoned bride, the distraction, the woman who could be used and dismissed. He had written her role before she arrived and had expected her to play it. She had declined, not heroically, not without fear, not without the nights when the scale of what she was attempting pressed against her chest like a physical weight, when she looked at Molly sleeping in the spare room and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She had declined with shaking hands, sometimes in a mind running the numbers on worst-case scenarios, and the particular grim persistence of someone who didn't have the option of giving up because there was a 5-year-old who needed her not to. That was not a heroic story, but it was a true one. In the spring following the verdict, Molly turned 6 and learned to read in earnest, not the halting letter-by-letter process of their lessons in the wagon and the sparse early weeks, but real reading, kind where the words disappeared and only the meaning remained. She read everything she could find, which at the Reed Ranch was limited primarily to seed catalogs, a 3-year-old almanac, and a collection of agricultural reports that Silas had accumulated for reasons he could not entirely explain. She also read, cover to cover, a book of American geography that Elena had ordered from a catalog in the fall, and that had arrived in February, somewhat battered by its journey. Montana is the 4th largest state, Molly informed Silas at dinner. But we aren't a state yet. We're a territory. That's right, Silas said. When do we become a state? There's talk of it, Silas said. Could be soon. Molly considered this. Will things be different? Some things, he said. The land stays the same. Appeared satisfied by this answer and returned to her catalog, which she was reading with the focused attention of someone making serious agricultural decisions. Elena watched them across the table, the 6-year-old and the rancher, both intent on their reading. The dog a warm weight against her feet under the table, where he was not technically supposed to be, but had been permitted to remain through the gradual erosion of everyone's resolve over the course of the winter. This was the thing she had not written to Caleb Thornton about in 6 months of correspondence. This ordinary evening, this table, this quiet. She had written about her capabilities and her history, and her hopes in careful, presentable sentences. She had not written about the specific quality of wanting an ordinary evening, the thing most people wanted, and most people rarely said directly, because it sounded too small to be a real ambition. It was not too small. It was, in fact, enormous. It was the thing all the large and difficult events of the past year had been protecting, without her quite recognizing it, the right to a quiet evening at her own table, in her own house, with her daughter and the man she had married, and a dog of questionable obedience. She had crossed 2,000 miles to find it. She had found it in the last place she had expected, under circumstances that would have broken someone more committed to the plan she had arrived with. She was grateful for the breaking. In early summer, Elena returned to the Harlow Creek train station for the first time since she had arrived. She went to collect a package account book she had ordered from a supplier in Chicago for the new financial system she was building, for 3 neighboring ranches who had hired her, in the months since the verdict, to review and reorganize their accounts. It was not the work she had expected to do in Montana. It was better work than she had expected to do anywhere. Silas drove her. Molly came, because Molly came to most things now, having established a general policy of inclusion that was difficult to argue with. They tied the wagon at the rail, and Elena went inside to collect the package from the station master, a different man than the one who had handed her Thornton's letter, which was one small mercy, and when she came back out, she stood on the platform for a moment. She had not planned to stop, but she stopped. The platform was the same platform. The boards were the same boards, or the same boards, plus a winter's worth of wear. The view from it was the main street of Harlow Creek, the buildings, the water tower still leaning slightly east. She had stood here with $11.40, and a 5-year-old and a 40-pound trunk, and a letter that had told her in 22 words that she was unwanted. She had stood here and she had not cried, because crying was a thing she could not afford. And she had looked at this town and decided, in the private wordless way that important decisions sometimes happen, she was not finished. She was not finished. She stood now with the package under her arm, and her husband at the bottom of the steps, and her daughter beside her telling Fletcher, who had also come, about the building across the street that she thought could be improved if the windows were larger. The letter from September was gone. She had kept it for a while, evidence, habit, the specific attachment that forms to things that changed your direction. And then one morning in February, she had put it in the stove, without particularly deciding to, the way you put a thing down when you finally understand you no longer need to carry it. What remained was everything she could see from this platform. The wagon and the horse. Silas, hands in his pockets, watching her the way he watched her steadily, without pressure, the way he had watched her from the beginning. Molly moving now toward Fletcher with some plan involving the hitching post. The street, the buildings, the territory that was becoming a state, the mountains in the far distance that she had not expected to love and had loved anyway. She thought about the women who had come west before her, the ones who had succeeded and the ones who hadn't, and how little the difference between them had to do with what they had planned. She thought about Agnes Drummond, standing in her empty farmhouse. She thought about the widow Beaumont, wherever she was in Oregon, and whether she would ever know. She thought about all the things that had been taken by a man who understood that other people's hope was a resource that could be harvested. She thought, you were wrong about me. You were wrong about what I would do and who I would become and what this territory would mean to me. You wrote the wrong story about me, and I wrote a different one, and mine is the one that held. She walked down the steps. Silas looked at her when she reached him. She looked back. All right, he said. All right, she said. He took the package from under her arm, without making a thing of it, and loaded it in the wagon. Climbed up to the bench. Molly arrived from the direction of the hitching post, mission accomplished or abandoned, and climbed up on the other side. They drove back through town and out the county road, and then the 4 miles to the ranch, the same 4 miles she had walked in September, with a heavy trunk and a child, and no certainty at all about what she was walking toward. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The fence lines were straight now, all of them. The north pasture was greening. The porch board that had been soft all winter had been replaced on a Tuesday in March, which she had not asked for, and which had been done while she was in town, and which Silas had not mentioned. She had noticed. She always noticed. The letter that had told her she was unwanted no longer mattered. Not because she had forgotten it. She hadn't. Because the pain of it was erased by what came after. It wasn't. But because the definition of herself that it offered unwanted, insufficient, a woman to be dismissed in 22 words had turned out to be entirely wrong. And the proof of its wrongness was not the verdict or the courtroom or the restored deed, but the ranch road under the wagon wheels, the smell of spring on the Montana air, Molly's hand in hers, Silas's shoulder warm against her arm. She had arrived as someone's mistake. She had become her own decision. And in the end, there was no letter in the world, and no man who wrote it, with the power to take that away.